Oh, hallelujah. Okay, great. I have a pretty loud voice, so usually I can handle not being mic'd, but this is a good sized room. So I wanted to welcome everybody. Thank you on behalf of New America and Family Story for joining us. We invited you here today because at the core of almost everybody's job in this room is a shared interest in family well-being. But we all obviously come at it from different organizational perspectives and different angles and using different sorts of tools. I want to say as we start that the decision to make this summit totally interdisciplinary was a really intentional one that we believe we all will benefit from. I think it's easy for us to lose sight of the big picture as we go about our work day to day. So today is possibly a different experience that you usually have at a conference or something else. We're really inviting you to step out of the boxes you normally work in to examine some assumptions underlying family and how it shows up in your work. And to really think aspirationally about what a new paradigm for valuing and supporting families might look like. I'm going to ask everybody to do a very, 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 very quick intro, although I have to say, looking at everybody's placards, you really all have your names. And does everybody? Okay, let's do this. Keep those in front of you, and if you don't have one, there's extras outside, and write it on so people know where you're from. I will say, rather than spending the time having everyone introduce themselves then, that this is a really incredible group. This is folks from, if you're kind of can't see everybody in the room, we have folks representing think tanks that do family policy work, economic policy work, racial justice work, economic justice work. We have researchers that are historians, sociologists, demographers. We have people from gender studies and critical race studies. We have a bunch of different foundations and philanthropists. We have a great group, and I hope that we'll take advantage of each other's shared expertise and knowledge. So I will just introduce myself. I'm Nicole Rogers. I'm the founder and co-director of Family Story. And I want to begin by sharing just a little bit about Family Story. Family Story believes essentially that the narrow and the rigid ways we define family within our laws and policies is not just an inconvenience, but it's an injustice. And that the way society assigns value and privileges certain types of families over others is both often ahistorical, unhelpful, and truly an affront to the dignity of so many of the families we purport to care about. It's no coincidence in my mind that the folks that are most marginalized in this country are also those that are least likely to live in married nuclear families. And I don't believe personally, and Family Story does not believe, that we can have family justice until society recognizes the many valuable ways families form and reform, and until our policies and practices actually support them in doing that. Since Family Story launched almost 2 years ago now, we've learned a few important lessons about the role of narrative, particularly when it comes to how people think and talk about how families have changed in recent decades. We've learned that there's a lot of fear around how family structures have changed, and that part of the reason why is that we're often told that these changes amount to what people often refer to as family breakdown. And I'm highlighting breakdown because that is sort of the key narrative word there. You know the conservative position on this, that all of society's problems can be blamed on family breakdown, and that more marriage and more nuclear families is the solution to that. Obviously, the fact that marriage promotion has been really a policy failure is a rather inconvenient fact. And the idea that marriage should be a precondition for our basic economic security and societal acceptance is, I think, problematic, to say the least. But the family breakdown narrative is one that indicts individuals for bad choices when it comes to forming their families, rather than indicting the systems that fail to support them. So it blames people for not doing families the right way. At Family Story, we reject this entire narrative. We don't see families breaking down. We see systems breaking down. We actually see people bonded together, not only through blood or legal ties, but through relationships sustained by love, care, and support for one another, who are actually really doing amazing jobs navigating systems that create obstacles and barriers from them at every point. We look at the ways that people form and reform family and their roles within family as one of constant evolution and one of people innovating in all sorts of fascinating ways against the odds. One example I wanted to share is that we just finished a new survey at Family Story on attitudes of unmarried women and unmarried mothers with Lake Research Partners that we'll be releasing later this month. And I won't go into detail about it now, but I wanted to share a few interesting findings that I think really exemplify the way attitudes and thinking about family is changing and the way policy is lagging behind people's lived experiences. The women we surveyed, which included married women, I should say, overwhelmingly agreed that a single parent can do just as good a job as two parents. And they also agreed that children do best with multiple adults invested in their lives and helping them, but that it was not necessary that those adults were two married parents. So they did understand the value of extra adults around, but they didn't actually think that if those were married parents, that was the most important thing. And a solid majority of the unmarried mothers we surveyed also said they would consider raising their child with somebody who is not a spouse or romantic partner, which really isn't part of our policy conversation at all. So that's just a small taste of some of the ways people are thinking about raising kids outside of nuclear families. And I think just sort of a suggestion of where we might expand our understanding of the types of relationships we could be supporting. So I want to invite everyone here today to question the conventional wisdom about what types of families are best for raising kids, to acknowledge what we don't know about what really matters, which is sometimes more important than what we do know. And I want to encourage us to ask questions about whose model of family we're privileging and to challenge assumptions about what family success looks like and in turn examine how this shapes our definition of who is successful. I want to ask us what it looks like to move from a model that treats anything outside of lifelong marriage and raising biological children as a deviation from some imagined ideal to one that reflects and anticipates the reality of our messy, complicated, beautiful, nonlinear lived experiences of family. So I'm thrilled to have you all here and excited for the day. And now I'm going to ask Rachel Black, who's over there from New America, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Rachel Black, and I co-direct our family-centered social policy program with Laura Bornfriend, who also directs our early education program, who is around the table here somewhere. So thank you all so much for being here. I think a few months ago, Mia and Nicole and I put together what was our fantasy football league of people who want to engage in this conversation, and somehow you all showed up. So this is just a really exciting event for us. So thank you so much for being here. The subject that we're talking about really hits to the core of what we're trying to do here at Family-Centered Social Policy, which is really investigate the role that identity plays in shaping our social policy and to develop tools to make our policies more representative and more responsive to the families that they're supposed to be serving. And I think we know that this has a long way to go from all of our work. We know that identity plays a very strong role in shaping our social policies, but frequently this identity is not one that's chosen by us. It's not ones that reflect how families show up in their lives. It's an identity that is chosen for them. It's one that's assigned and oftentimes just politically expedient. Through the history of welfare policy, this comes up time and time again. During the Depression, to gen up support for cash-based welfare, the face of that policy was a white woman. It was a white mother. Shifting to the war on poverty. I mean, again, we see the face of welfare policy being white, generally this time a white father. This is a pretty sharp contrast to kind of the face that welfare takes on when we're trying to decrease support, which inevitably shifts to the face of a black mother. Even though throughout the history of the program, the face of welfare continues to be white. So we know that oftentimes these identities are shaped in absence of evidence and according to really the needs and the priorities of the people who are making policy rather than the needs and the priorities of the people that the policy is supposed to be serving. So really this is, sits at the crux of what we're trying to do and really kind of what animates this conversation. For us, not only is this inequitable and marginalizing, but it's also anti-democratic, right? I mean, our democratic institutions are not functioning well when we live in a representative democracy that does not, in fact, represent many of the citizens of our country. So I think what we're trying to do today is set a new vision to replace this broken system, and that means, coming up with a new set of laws and policies that regard all families as having equal value and each deserving of dignity and respect, and providing the support that they need to equally engage in our economy, our society, and our political structures. And if these are our goals, as Nicole said earlier, I think we have to be pretty rigorous in interrogating our basic assumptions about who families are, what they deserve, and under what circumstances, and how we give all families really the power and the voice that they need to influence this process. So I'm going to stop there and actually deviate a little bit from our agenda. New America's President and CEO, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's written extensively and is really a thought leader in this field. We thought she was not going to be available today, but miraculously has materialized in our presence. So I'm going to pivot over to Anne-Marie to say a few words.
Wasn't supposed to be here today, and so I didn't know this was happening. I live still in Princeton, and I live mostly on a train. I'm here 2 days a week and then in New York 1 day a week. And so I walked in and I said, so what's going on? And they told me, and I said, that's right up my alley. So let me just say three quick things about this. And this work is so close to my heart. Although I have to laugh when I looked at the end of the nuclear age, how the future of family depends letting go of the past connects both my identities. When I see the end of the nuclear age, I don't mean the nuclear family. So the three ways that I think about this work in its broadest context. And the one, where is Mia? Oh, no, sorry, Mia Birdsong. Oh, sorry, there, right there. I was looking up at Simone. I'm thinking, that's not Mia. So when Mia became a New America California Fellow, and I read her work, something clicked so fundamentally for me that this idea of the American family, and particularly the African American family, which means the families of poor folk in many ways who have always been adaptable and flexible and supportive and resilient, the idea that that would be the face of innovation and adaptability in American society, something that everybody loves, innovative, flexible, adaptable, as opposed to the face of dysfunction, was truly revolutionary for me. And so that is the one place I want to start, this notion that family is a social structure in the United States that can exemplify the things we celebrate about the United States, rather than this kind of ridiculous 1950s temporary image of what the perfect family was supposed to be, is exactly what New America is about. It's renewing an old institution in a way that we see it anew, and it can be a new building block. That's the first point. The second is really, this is so critical to what it really means to have women as leaders. And as you know, I write deeply about women and men as caregivers. I do not think this is only women, but what I do think, having, as a feminist who cut my teeth on the deconstructing the divide between public and private, right? That's what feminism was in the 70s, right? The private was the family space, and law didn't go there, which meant you could do whatever you wanted in that space for domestic violence, whatever else it was. And the early feminists, Kitty McKinnon, all the great lawyers deconstructed that space. And we don't want it completely deconstructed because we don't want the government controlling our family lives. But the reason that was so separate is that was the women's world, right? So men were important, and public issues were about men, and family was for women, and that was private, and what happened there wasn't of government, of policy concern. If women are now fully equal in public space, then our traditional domain, but only traditional really in the sense of the industrial age, because in the agricultural age, family and work were fused, so this is itself an artifact of a particular time. If those two things, if we're now fully in the public space, our leadership has to be around what is the role of, and it's not the only thing, but where is family, and how important it is as a building block of our society and our economy, as a core part. It's not this thing over there. It's at the center of who we are and what we do. Last thing. We've done a lot of work on the future of work at New America. And one of the things that's come out is that the care economy is a huge part of the future of work. It is very hard to automate, and it is essential if you understand care as investing in others, which is what family care is. It's investing in our children, it's helping, it's ensuring that they reach their full potential, and it is caring for those who cared for us. That's part of the bargain. That notion of care as investing in others is true in teaching, it's true in medicine, it's true in coaching, it's true in advising, and look where the jobs are going. And a lot of them go with big data, right? So early ed and what we really need for early ed, whether you're in the family or in caregiving. Elder care, same way. Education, so much of education is going to be coaching and advising as people sort of teach themselves, but not alone, right? So we merge technology and the human ability to inspire and mentor and coach others. So the care economy, if you watch it and you think of it broadly as including advising, teaching, all kinds of healthcare, all sorts of preventive care, it is a huge part of the future of work. And how that space intersects with core family. Because again, you don't want to replace you don't want to say, well, it's all this sort of neutral space where you pay for it. No, family is a core part of that. But that work that women have always done and not been paid for now has to be elevated and valued and compensated and recognized whether you get paid for it or not. So this work is incredibly important. I would love to be able to sit here and listen to you all day. I'm going to take this away and read it. But just know that when I think about American renewal, family-centered social policy is absolutely at the core. Thank you.
I'm going to pass this over right now to Pamela Schiffman, who is the president of the Nova Foundation, just to say a few words before we get started about the role of philanthropy and thinking about family justice.
I speak very loudly, so I generally don't need mics, but thank you so much. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Mia. I have to say, I think you and Family Story are doing some of the most revolutionary, transformative work that's out there right now, and I feel so honored to be able to work with you and be able to partner with you. So thank you all, and thank you for this day. I've been so excited for today, so thank you. I actually want to just start by bringing two women into the room who have really influenced me and my thinking and the thinking at the Novo Foundation about the importance of family justice. And I think one of them many of you have heard of, and one of them you haven't, likely. The first is a woman who was really a pioneer of the family justice movement, though it wasn't called that then. And I think my neighbor to the right definitely knows her. Paula Edelbrick, who was my law professor and mentor and a really, really important feminist LGBT rights leader who really helped us to think about the possibility of family in a different way. Now, Paula is most known for a piece she wrote in 1989 debating Tom Stoppard, which is called "Since When Is Marriage a Path to Liberation?" But I actually want to share some words that Paula shared just a few years after that, which I think will really help us set a stage for today. So Paula said, the problem in this area is not so much that lesbian and gay couples cannot marry. Rather, it is that all of the legal and social benefits and privileges constructed for families are available only to those families joined by marriage and biology. Why would we want to join an exclusive club we once sought to dismantle? Why not establish a new club? And I wanted to share that because I'm hoping that today what we might be able to do is to think about all the new clubs we might be able to establish, because I think there is really exciting clubs out there and really exciting potential. So I wanted to bring Paula into the room. I also wanted to say today when I got the invitation for this event, I took a breath back because today is the 4th anniversary of the death of my best friend, who died when she was 40 years old today, 4 years ago. And during Jill, her name is Jill, and during Jill's illness, and after she died, I was able to take a lot of time to be with her. I was able to be at her bedside for the 2 weeks before she died. I was able to be with her for the week. I was able to be there for the week after. I was able to, I worked for an employer that really saw Jill as my family. We weren't biologically related. You know, she wasn't my romantic partner. She was my dearest friend in the world. And I felt really lucky to be able to work at a place that honored that and that didn't require me to prove some other kind of relationship in order to be able to be with the person who was the most important person in my life. And I see how many other places have policies which are so well-intentioned and so harmful. You know, I was just doing a quick, review and looking at the City University of New York and their policy. Immediate family members, you get 2 days of bereavement time. You know, people who their aunt has raised them their whole life actually don't get any time for bereavement if they want to, grieve for their aunt who raised them. You know, I look at something like Facebook, which passed a really progressive policy, I think, after Sheryl Sandberg lost her husband, and it has 3 days, I believe it's 3 days for immediate family and 1 day for other family. And I think, well, how does that, why is it so important to define who you get to grieve for? Why is it so critical? Why can't we be more creative about addressing that? So I wanted to bring both of those women in the room because I feel like that, both because family justice is totally personal, actually, that's the thing. It's like gets at the core of who we are as people in the way that our families are core to our lives. Family justice is actually core to any social justice work that we do. So just to turn quickly to say, for Novo, family justice is 100% fundamental to all the work that we are doing to end violence and discrimination against all women and all girls. That's a really important part of what we do at the Novo Foundation, and there's no way we're going to do that without having family justice. Yesterday, we hosted a conference called Grantmakers for Girls of Color, which was looking at the structural barriers to inequity that girls of color in the United States face. And Alvin Starks was on the stage. If you don't know him, you should. He's amazing. At the Open Society Foundation, and he asked this question. When we are talking about poverty of children, why is it the immediate place that all philanthropy and everyone is talking about is about family structure? Why is it always that we're talking about single mothers, and particularly single mothers of color, and particularly Black single mothers? So why instead are we in philanthropy not asking these questions about why mothers make less money? Why are we not asking why women's labor gets devalued? Why are we not asking why Black single women have median wealth of $100 US and white single men have a median wealth of $44,000 US? Like, why are we not asking those questions? And the reason I think we're not asking those questions is because those are really hard. Like, we have to actually look at structural inequity to be able to answer that. We actually have to be able to address the pervasive racism and sexism which underlies everything in our country. And as philanthropy, we need to be able to respond to that well. So I think that the reason that is the reason that we're not, and I actually think the reason we have to as philanthropy, and I'm so excited to think about how we engage more philanthropists in this, is because if we don't address family justice, we won't get economic justice. And if we don't address family justice, we won't get racial justice. And if we don't address family justice, we won't get gender justice, and so on. So I think it actually provides a piece of the puzzle that we have not actually used. I think this framework provides an opportunity for us to actually address the underlying structural inequities and to really promote social justice that we all want. So thank you again for inviting me to be here, and I'm excited for the day. Thank you.
Check, check. All right, you can't hear me in this microphone. There we go. Okay. Thank you, Pamela. I'm Mia Birdsong. I am co-director of Family Story and a New America Fellow. And I'm going to tell you a little story, quickly. My stepsister, Tina, is an unmarried single mother of 2 kids. Scarlett, who is a spunky 14-year-old on the autism spectrum, and Declan, who is an 8-year-old with really intense ADHD. Tina has been an amazing parent to both of them. She's advocated really hard for Scarlett to get the services she needs, which are many, and for Dec to not be labeled a bad kid in school. Tina is a feminist and an anti-racist white person raising her kids to be anti-racist feminists in a part of the country where they will have lots of opportunity to practice defending their values. Tina's been on public assistance for most of her kids' lives. And she is acutely aware of the way that those systems have been set up to make families like hers jump through hoops to prove that they are deserving of the things we are all entitled to. Things like housing and food and education. She's navigated these systems and raised her children largely without the regular support of anyone else. That is until she met Terry at roller derby. Terry is a stepmom who has part-time custody of her stepson. Terry needed a place to live post-divorce, and Tina had extra room. It was supposed to be temporary until Terry found another place to live, but what happened was a surprise to everyone. They became family. They co-parent the kids together, they share household responsibilities, and they love and support each other. Everybody is better off because of it. Tina's only regret is that she did not do this 10 years ago. Today, we are talking about family and the places family life shows up in some really big picture ways. But I want all of us to ground ourselves in the fact that we're talking about the lives of real people. If we think about families who are most impacted by our harmful family narratives, policies, and systems, we're talking about people who are poor, people of color, undocumented folks, queer folks, single moms. And as so often the case, most of those folks are not here in the room with us. So I want all of us to take a minute to think about actual families we know, whose lives will be better off when we reject systems and policies and narratives that function on a hierarchy of family structure and move to ground our work in a vision of family justice in which all families, regardless of structure, are supported, celebrated, respected, and valued. I want us to hold these families in our minds today. And I'm going to give us a minute. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to give us a minute to think about who those people are. Keep them with you when we're talking. Some final thoughts before we go on to other thoughts that are not final. We encourage respectful disagreement in this space. Let's wrestle with the hard questions, challenge each other's assumptions, own our blind spots, and be willing to change our minds. That means sitting with discomfort sometimes. We hope that today you will spend some time in the zone of productive disequilibrium. That is where we grow. We all have areas of professional expertise, but let's bring our whole selves and experience into the room. We don't have a lot of breaks during this day, so take care of yourself. There's food. Rachel, where are the bathrooms? Follow the big arrow when you got to do your business. The Wi-Fi, if you have not figured it out, is New America Guest 2 or 5, and the password is New America Guest. So if you need that, you have it. With that, let's get started.
Okay, so I want to introduce you all to Stephanie Kuntz. I'm sure many of you know Stephanie. And as we kick off our first session, I have asked Stephanie to say a few words and to speak to us a little bit about the ways family have changed over the past 50 years or so, and to do a little bit of level setting for us. So something to take with us through the day as we really think about the changes families face as really one of constant evolution. And I have asked Stephanie, I know I told you all this is an intimate experience and you all must sit at a table with me, but I have asked Stephanie to speak at the podium because she is our one person today who's giving a brief presentation, and she is not very tall. And she'd like to be able to see all you. So Stephanie, thank you.
Which I never use. But I did bring notes because when you have to speak for only 10 minutes, it needs a lot more prep than when you get to speak for an hour. So I want to gallop a few of the things that Nicole asked me to talk about, and maybe a couple that she didn't. But for starters, we often use the word traditional when we talk about the 1950s family, whether the male breadwinner family. But that's actually the least traditional. I can document this, and probably most fleeting work-family arrangement in history. As you know, for thousands of years, families were places where women, men, and children all worked to produce the material necessities of life and even of trade. And in many societies, yes, women's freedom to travel beyond the household was restricted, but what that meant was that women were prohibited from leaving the labor force, not from joining the labor force. Men were bosses precisely because they needed the labor of women and children. The concept of a male breadwinner was unknown until the 19th century. Colonial wives were called yoke mates and deputies. They didn't wait for the men to bring home the bacon. They raised the pig, cured it, and took it to market. Older children cared for younger children because wives were too busy making a living. And then in the 19th century, we got a new invention among a privileged section of the middle class, the white middle class, where women were able to withdraw from their traditional productive functions precisely because children as young as 6, 7, and 8 were going out to the mills and factories to produce the clothes and the more ready-made food ingredients that still needed to be processed by those women, but that used to take up all their time at home. Not until the end of the 1920s economic boom did a tiny majority of children live in a family where the mother wasn't earning income and they could go to school instead of out to work. That family form receded in the Depression and World War II, roared back in the 50s, largely because post-war policymakers and business leaders explicitly reorganized labor policies, tax codes, zoning policies, social support systems, home financing to incentivize and subsidize male breadwinner families. But that Ozzie and Harriet family rested on a unique combination of features. First, an exceptionally strong economy in which labor claimed a larger share of productivity output than ever before or since. A repressive gender regime that gave women almost no access to the economic expansion except through marriage. And a set of racially discriminatory and other discriminatory arrangements that penalized people who could not or would not live up to or down to the new family norms, and literally whited out the experience of such people. Together, those conditions created an unprecedented degree of uniformity in family life. From 1950 until 1970, half of all women married before they turned 21. By 1960, fewer than 8% of women were still unmarried at ages 30 to 34. Unmarried couples accounted for less than 1% of all households, only one child in 300, and I owe this to Council on Contemporary Families report prepared by Philip Cohen here, were raised by a never married woman. GLBT families were off the radar, and fewer than 1 in 5 children lived in a family where both couples worked. Today, by contrast, the majority of the 25 to 34-year-old adults in the workplace are unmarried. though a significant proportion have obligation to their parents, as parents, or as unmarried partners. Most kids, there are actually more kids being raised in cohabiting couple households than in married couple households. 40% of births are out of wedlock. As of 2016, there were 9.8 million single moms raising kids under age 18, almost twice as many as the approximately 5 million stay-at-home moms in married couples' families. But even these male breadwinner stay-at-home families have changed. You know, back in the 50s, these were most common among the middle classes. Now, the only section of the population where stay-at-home moms are a majority is among women married to men in the bottom 25% of the earnings distribution. Meanwhile, even as divorce rates have been falling for people in their primary child-rearing years, even old age has been shaken up. Since 1990, the divorce rate has doubled for people over 50 and tripled for people over 65. So for better or worse, the hegemony of the Ozzie and Harriet family has been shattered, and contrary to popular opinion, there's been a lot of better in that. I thought I would spend a few moments in that. When I was, when in the 1980s and 90s, when I was writing my first book, The Way We Never Were, I was just, just everybody was predicting disaster from such rearrangements of family life. And certainly there have been challenges. You know, divorce has reduced the bargaining power of people, of the person who wants the marriage to last. It's certainly created financial and psychological strains for many adults and children, although a lot of those strains occurred before and or the reason for the divorce. But in every state that adopted no-fault divorce, this is important to understand, yes, it raised the divorce rate, but every state that adopted it saw an 18 to 13% decline in wives' suicide rates, an average 30% decline in domestic violence, and so it got rid of the truly bad marriages. And as a matter of fact, since these changes for the population as a whole, for single women, for cohabiting couples, as well as married couples, cohabiting couples used to have much higher murder rates and domestic violence rates, no longer true. Rates of sexual assault and domestic violence have fallen almost continuously since the 70s. By dramatic percentages, if you look at the victim survey, not just the police reported. And despite the increase in unconventional families since during the 70s and 80s, kids born in those years, people forget this, have actually done better as teenagers and young adults than kids born in the 50s and 60s. Teen pregnancy has been falling steadily. The age of sexual initiation has risen. Underage drinking has plummeted since the 1990s. It fell by another 30% just between 2002 and 2015. Between 1991 and 2002, teen homicide and assault rates dropped to their lowest level since 1966. And in 2014, they hit their lowest level since 1960. Yes, there are more non-residential fathers than in the past, but residential fathers have tripled the time they spend with children. Non-residential fathers have increased the amount of time that they devote. And women have increased the time they spend in developmental child care so much that on average, both employed mothers and single mothers spend more time interacting with their children than stay-at-home married mothers did in the 1960s. Now, I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna, and in this way, I want to be absolutely clear. More choices allow more people to get out of bad situations and construct better ones, but they also open new ways to screw up, let's face it. And as the old rules of organizing life and relationships become unworkable or even backfire, many of the things that made for relationship stability in the 50s and 60s now undermine it. We're still figuring out how best to make these arrangements work. And ironic, but I want to make the point that ironically some of the most serious challenges families face today are the flip side of the gains we've made. Our higher, better expectations of relationships, along with the decline of male privilege and the rise of female independence, have multiplied the work that it takes to make a family going. Relationships require more time and energy, more patience, more negotiating skills than when expectations of family closer were lower, gender roles were more rigid, and people's options outside marriage were more limited. And then on top of that, possibly less, certainly less positively, this has occurred just as there's been increasing need to privately purchase and arrange enrichment activities and resources for kids that we used to be able to leave up to schools and neighborhoods. When people have the time, energy, and financial ability to make these psychological and material investments work in the family, families, as I've been studying family life for I haven't been studied it for 5,000 years, but my research goes back 5,000 years. Families are closer, fairer, and more beneficial for every family member than ever, not just some, than ever before in history. But old social policies and new economic realities make it much more difficult for individuals and families to realize that potential. One big stressor, of course, is the lack of family-friendly work policies in a country where 70% of kids live in households where every adult works, and more than 20% of the population is giving some kind of care to elders. I think Bridget will talk more about that. The other big challenge, and this one we need to be clear about its destructive effects on families, is the clash between our new personal freedoms and the growing insecurity of employment, volatility of income, inequality of assets, and erosion of social protections. So just as, this is a terrible irony facing low-educated and low-income Americans, just as more effort, skill, and engagement, and even resources are being demanded of them as partners and parents, many of them are losing the stable communities, the social support systems, the daily predictability of income and job security that gives people the resilience to cope with parenting or couple demands, the skill to negotiate, the incentives to refrain from behaviors that offer short-term escape from such stress but undermine long-term success. So if I had time, I would talk about the tremendous amount of new resource that's challenging the studies that claim to control for income and stuff and show that there's still, in the United States, much more than in any other country, leftover problems in some of these family rearrangements. But let me just emphasize briefly that scarcity, insecurity, and lack of control of money in particular, but also time. I'm sure you've seen the research that it just creates tunnel vision, focusing on people on what's missing here and now rather than their ability to plan their lives. One study of farmers in Asia found that living with material scarcity for just a few months caused the equivalent of a 13-point drop in their IQ, in their reasoning power and judgment during those months. Here in America, new research by psychologists show that financial strain, time pressures, and stressful life events are the most powerful predictor of negative interactions between couples, outweighing family background, childhood experiences, parental divorce, and overall family values. People who can repair negative interactions when they're not stressed become markedly less forgiving and more reactive. The longer it continues, the worse it becomes. And such negative interactions between partners are just as strong a predictor of ineffective parenting as ignorance of parenting practices. So the good news that we need to think about today as we discuss these is that possibilities for fairness, intimacy, and growth in personal and family life are much greater than they have ever been. This is the first time ever we have had the opportunity to establish relationships free of coercion by biology, by racial hierarchies, gender hierarchies, sexual hierarchies, by the ability of elders to dictate to the young, by women's subordination. And we have solid research on ways to improve outcomes. I love it because actually it turns out that throwing money at things sometimes helps. But the bad news is that most of our social programs, support systems, and cultural instructions for personal life are still designed for a set of work and family arrangements and economic conditions that ceased to be the norm 40 years ago. So I hope that's a little start and not too obvious for us to talk about as we go on. Thanks.
Jump now into a discussion and bring in C. Nicole Mason, Claire Huntington, and Bridget Schulte to help identify what some of the core issues that are really kind of animating the day are, and then open it up for everybody else. Since we're a little behind in the agenda, we're going to transition to a break at 10:30 and scale back that break to 5 minutes, so be fast. Everybody knows where the bathrooms are. So, I mean, there's so many things that Stephanie really kind of set out for us that are worth teasing out. You know, I think in the interest of using this conversation to set a baseline for the rest of the day, you know, I think one of the things that we want to start with is figuring out really kind of why this construct is persisting, right? You know, I think Anne Marie mentioned in her opening remarks, really this old separate spheres framework, right? And I think in a lot of ways, we're still kind of operating in a space where people perceive, you know, family to exist independently of the state, right? And this is something, Claire, I'd really like to bring you into, because this is something that you've documented so extensively in your own work, all the way that family shows up in law and policy, and really what the impact of that is.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. Is this on? Yeah. Now it's working. Okay. So thank you so much, Stephanie. I think that was a great way to lay the groundwork. What I want to do is build off a bit of what you were talking about in terms of social policy, and talk about we're talking about the present, and then go back to the past, and particularly connect it to the separate spheres idea. So I think what really marks the United States as different basically from every other wealthy country is that we expect families to pay for the expense of raising children, rather than sharing that among our whole society. So what's interesting, if you look, you know, Sweden's always held up, oh, they provide so much to their children. They do, but actually if you look at the whole, the entire amount of money that families spend and that the government spends on families, in the United States, sort of per child, is actually the same as in Sweden, right? We spend the same amount, but it's more, for them, it comes from the government. So they spend 5 times as much of their GDP on family benefits as we do. So it's the proportion that is radically different in our country. And what that means, like Stephanie said, is that if you have the means, which you have because we have basically pretty low tax rates comparatively to other countries. So if you are making a decent wage, you are able to keep a lot of that money. You get a benefit from the government through the home mortgage interest deduction, all those things. You have a lot of money left over to provide a remarkable childhood, you know, from music lessons to summer camp to tutors, you know, whatever it might be. And those children, yes, they're overscheduled, and yes, they're frazzled and stressed, but they are ready for school and ready for the workplace. Families that don't have that, right, they can't provide that. They are not able to. Even just school sports teams, you have to pay for equipment. You have to pay to be able to play. You know, summer camp, right? These are, children have remarkably enriching experiences over summer camp, but middle and lower income kids don't. Those camps are so expensive. And so what we've actually seen in terms of the achievement gap is that schools really do narrow the achievement gap, but then it widens again over the summer. Again, based on sort of old models, because our summer is based on agricultural model, as if kids need to be in the field. They don't, right? So this idea that families are responsible, this leads to tremendous inequality. But what I wanted to say was that it didn't actually used to be this way, right? We did actually used to think that the government had some role in protecting families from real economic shocks, but protecting only some families, right? So this really, the history of social programs, as Rachel said before, is really the history of racism in our country. So back in the first federal program, the Aid to Dependent Children, 1935, that was a way, the whole idea was to enable women who did not have a breadwinner to be able to let them stay at home and take care of their children, right? So it was very much based on the separate spheres ideology, that women are the ones who should care for their kids, but that we really thought the government should play some role in helping women do that. But that law was written with this provision called the suitable home provision, which gave social workers tremendous discretion to decide who was a suitable home, and only children in suitable homes would get this government support. And so what it meant was basically they absolutely knocked off all women of color, but also what we then called illegitimate children, now we'd call non-marital children. So for example, in 1960, for every 1,000 kids, there were about 79 children that would have been eligible, just as if you just purely means tested. Only about 30 of them actually got the support, right? And the support would then come from white families. So part of it is, and well, just one more quick little historical piece, which is, so then in the 60s and 70s, we had a whole series of lawsuits based on the Constitution and statutes to try and make welfare more open that were quite successful. And then, no coincidence, as a result, that's when welfare became punitive. It became a sign of dependency and pathology and, all of the things that we know that go along with the trope of the welfare queen. That was when we had this new idea, precisely because the face of welfare changed. Now that suddenly, basically, black women were able to get it, not just white women, then welfare and government support became a real problem. So I guess I just want us to, it's easy to think that the government has never supported families, but I want to say that also this idea of government support as somehow creating an unhealthy, dependency, that is relatively new too as well, and really only dates to the 1970s.
So I think something that really surfaced for me listening to you talk, Claire, is not only just the fallacy of state intervention, but the different forms it takes and what it communicates about the people who are on the receiving end, right?
Yeah.
So, so many of the policies that you mentioned that benefit higher income households are distributed through the tax code, right? And by virtue of being distributed for the tax code, one, they're kind of invisible, right? It's like the submerged state concept. But it also reinforces the idea of value and deserving, right? You are a taxpayer, you are earning income, you are getting back what you put into it, versus other programs like child care subsidies or cash welfare, which very much makes you the taker, right? And it's very easy to layer on other kind of punitive policies attached to that. I mean, thinking about just TANF, for example, having to specify that you're disqualified if you have lottery earnings. You can't use your benefits at casinos or strip clubs. Mississippi, because of course they had to, also made it benefits at lingerie shops and nail salons. So I mean, you can see how gendered and racism plays such a decisive role in shaping these things. Nicole Mason is here somewhere.
Hi, down here.
Hey, Nicole.
Hi, but my,
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me
It's not
at
on.
all. So I'm just going to yell a little bit. So your book, Born Bright, I think lays out so clearly the way that the system is really just kind of set up for people who don't conform to that dominant narrative to fail, right? And documented in that is how you were able to succeed in spite of basically every institution and policy being set to a default against that happening. Can you talk about what some of the narratives that are baked into those design choices are?
Absolutely. Is it? Okay. So, in terms of my own work and research and thinking about Born Bright, before I do that, I want to ground myself in the conversation that I'm really grateful for Mia and Nicole for inviting me here. But I'm a queer single mother by choice, and I have 7-year-old twins, and that's how I entered this conversation. When I was writing Born Bright, I was also thinking about my experience as a motherhood, as a mother, compared to my own mother's experience as a single mother who was burdened by a lot of the negative narratives and stereotypes of black women and black families at the time. But she was also, we were also living in poverty. So my experience as a child and the things I had access to is different than the things my children have access to, but also shaped her own experience with motherhood. So when I think about my work and my research and thinking about the narratives and the representation of Black women, Latino women, and white women, and their experiences of motherhood, what we know is that single mothers, low-income mothers, have different narratives than white women, even if they are all single, right? So one, for example, Latino and Black moms are likely to be framed as pathological, broken, working in deficit. And when we think about how single white women are framed in the dominant narratives around single motherhood, it's more empathetic, like, her husband must have died, or they, divorced, or something like that, and even empowering. So even the idea that I, for myself, take up the identify as a single mother by choice, which has recently been exclusively white middle-class women who chose to parent on their own. And for me, even when I told people, that wasn't a choice for me. There was already a narrative mapped onto my experiences. And the questions, the assumptions, even today, the assumptions about where my husband is, or how I move in community and neighborhood has been shaped by these narratives. And one of the other things that I want to say, because this is more of a roundtable, is that, and listening to Stephanie talk, what I was struck by in the trends is that there's a lot that we don't know a lot about. So my family, for example, is missing from that narrative, and LGBTQ families in general are missing from that narrative. And we are not taught, we're talking about, and I think we talked about, someone mentioned this earlier, that there's an investment in these narratives and almost a mourning of the loss of some ideal that was never really true for a lot of people in the country, including families of color, but also LGBTQ families. So in my own work in Born Bright, I really wanted to try to shift the narrative of families and create a more accurate picture of what it's really like to be in community, and to complicate it a little bit. And I think I was able to do it. And I was also really intent on telling a truer narrative, and resist, because I think there's a lot of resistance to different narratives, or shifting the narratives, but they're not new narratives, they are just truer and more reflective of people's lived experiences.
Maybe, okay, yeah. Because this is really, storytelling is at the core of your work, right? Public policy, and I mean, you are really investigating the interplay between story and policy, right? The stories that policies tell, deserving and undeserving, and the power of story to change policy. Can you tell us, like from your own work, kind of what that interplay is and what it means kind of for theory of change, of disrupting this narrative that's hurting so many families?
Can you guys all hear? Stephanie, in her fantastic introduction there, she talked about the hegemony of Ozzie and Harriet. And that is so true. And that it's strange that the data is so clear that was a really a blip in history. And Nicole, you talk about there seems to be this mourning of the passing away of this family that really wasn't ever a dominant sort of narrative. So I guess my question that came up is like, well, who's mourning? Who is mourning the passage of that family? It was an incredibly repressive and dysfunctional in its own right, and yet those are not. I don't want to say those aren't the stories we don't tell, because that's what all the great literature and movies are about, is how horrible that time was for so many people, and yet it doesn't seem to stick, because the people who are mourning are the people who are in power, and are the people who have the power to tell that narrative. Just in terms of the power of story, when I work a lot on childcare and early care and learning and paid family leave, as so many of us are as well. And why is the United States so far behind other advanced economies when it comes to some really basic sort of matching of policy to reality? And you would think that we're this capitalist country, we would be so animated by economic growth and gains, and there's study after study about if you have full employment, if you really upskill and you put everybody to work, well, we'd be so much more productive, and yet we're still really stuck all across the socioeconomic spectrum. And so, it is. I think that Ozzie and Harriet is really a narrative that we still have to contend with. I sent Rachel a video yesterday. I'm just so struck by it. The right after the Second World War, when Rosie the Riveter went to work. Your tax dollars at work. There was a government propaganda, basically, of sort of a film campaign to try to get women to go back to work. And there's a video, it's called Modern Woman, The Lost Sex. And it's this black and white video, and it starts with this stentorian voice. The family was based on the father as breadwinner and patriarch, and mother as nurse to the children. That this was so comforting and so wonderful. And then it's like, and nothing is more threatening to the future of America than women's economic independence. And it showed women in factories, and it's like, and now they're not paying attention to their children, and it showed children playing in the street and little kids starting to smoke, and it was just horrible, But I think that that's really important to bring up, because as dated and as funny as that seems, those are still either consciously or unconsciously so much of what's driving policy and story, and it's a lot of what we have to contend with. So that's not only, it's so harmful because it's, for one thing, it's not true, but in terms of kind of what moves things, I'll just very briefly talk about two things. And one is, there was a time, so we've done a big child care report here, and just talking about inequality and unfairness, we found that the cost of infant care is more than the cost of in-state college tuition in 33 states. And you don't have 18 years to save up for that. And if you don't have those kind of resources, a lot of families are forced to make the decision that they can't even afford to work because there isn't, unless you have an extended network. And a lot of that is very informal and, very rickety, and, people are struggling to make things, juggling to make that work. And that's just really, when you talk about control and predictability, the fewer resources that you have to buy that kind of care, the more unpredictable and unstable your life is, which does increase that sense of strife and stress, which does have long-term impacts on you, your health, and as well as your children's health, physically, mentally, financially. But there was a time in the United States that, and I'm sure you guys all know this, that we did have government-supported childcare. It was during the Second World War when we did want Rosie the Riveter at work because all the guys were over fighting. And the way that came about, it wasn't sort of a counter to Ozzie and Harriet, but there was a powerful story that came out of women going to work in these shipyards and kids being left in the car. And now today, if that story came out, those mothers would be in jail. But then there was sort of this outcry. There was actually stories that were introduced into the congressional record, and there was this outcry. It's like, oh, how could this be happening in the United States? And so it was, they began building child care centers at these shipyards. And interestingly, it did not come through any kind of family policy. It came through like an infrastructure bill. So it didn't even go through sort of the family route. But that did change the experience, and it did change policy. But again, it was very short-lived, because then we had the modern woman, the lost sex, and go home or your kids are going to be run over. And then the second thing that I think is very interesting and I think really instructive, when you look at design theory, they say that you can't really think your way into a new way of acting, but you can act your way into a new way of thinking. And sometimes policy can act like that. And so when you look at gender equality, one of the, the unpaid work, and yes, it's true that men are doing 3 times the childcare than they were decades ago, but mothers are still doing twice as much childcare and 2 to 3 times as much housework, because they've ratcheted up that as well. And that's true across socioeconomic levels, but very true at the middle and upper middle class levels. And so countries that had long maternity leaves, they were seeing that that was really disadvantaging women in the long run. And so they began to try to experiment, sort of how can we experiment to try to make the norm that not only women are caregivers, but men are caregivers as well, to try to equalize those public and private spheres. And so a couple countries like Iceland, they created use it or lose it daddy day quotas. And what was interesting when I've done some reporting there is that really not only changed the experience, it changed the narrative and it changed the culture. And so then what happened is instead of being the good father if you worked longer and you put in more hours so that you could win more bread or earn more money, and that's the way you proved your fatherhood bona fides or your masculinity, then it became a good father took that daddy day quota because, oh my God, you're gonna not take your 3 months? What kind of father are you? So it completely changed the narrative. I was talking to a young man from Norway. He said, yeah, now the friends call each other up. It's just like, hey, is your wife pregnant yet? You want to take our daddy days together? So it's really changed. That's an example of not a story, but a policy actually changing the story. So it can really go either way.
Can I add one sentence to the shipyard thing? My mother worked in one of those shipyard works, and where they had child care centers. And she said one thing they did that I've never seen written up, but she was so impressed with it, is that they had people with kids old enough to do this bring stuff for dinner, and the kids would make the dinner and then take it home in a lunch pail.
Sorry, this is Mia. I just want to ask Nicole a question since we're having a conversation. This is Nicole. So I think in the continued kind of examination of the differences between men and women's labor outside and inside the home, we miss an impact that this specifically has on lesbian mothers who there ain't no man around to potentially bring in money or balance out something in any way. And I'd like you to speak to that because it's missing from that narrative.
So I think, again, and when we think about the kind of policies and we think about family policies, there are families that disappear in the narrative because it is such a it's very binary and it's very heteronormative. And for me, I'm currently without a partner, so most of all of the care and income, it rests on my shoulders, and it's been like that for majority of my time as a mother. But there are no, in terms of policies, in terms of being able to access support, it is, what do I want to say? It's a bit more challenging because I have to do a lot of explaining about my familial status, or even thinking about where I make community and in my neighborhood. So for example, I live in a family-oriented neighborhood where it's very heteronormative, and I'm there for very specific reasons. So the school, it's a more connected community. But the social treatment that I receive from my neighbors is different. I feel like there's a search for a husband every time somebody knocks on my door for the first couple of months, and some people would ask outright, is he in the military? Is he, where's their dad? And so, but those things, that makes it harder in terms of, even with my kids, I think it's also a challenge. But I think in these family conversations, and we think about family policy, making room and expanding the narrative, and even changing the language and the way we talk about and frame some of the policies, like rewriting policies so it's not automatically assumed that there's a man and a woman. But now that I still have the mic. I also want to say about just about the power of stories and policies and making that link. when, I mean, it is related to what I just said, but when we think about the kinds of policies and the damages, the impact of these narratives, I think it's really very real. So when we think about welfare reform, the welfare reform policy that was created in 1996, and the dominant narrative was that people, mostly black women and Latino women and women of color, are lazy and don't like to work. We got a policy on the end that said if you want to receive benefits, you must work. There was no consideration of childcare, other work supports, or any other things. And so many of us advocates spend a lot of time working around that broken system, and I feel like we really still are doing that. So I feel like there is a really, in terms of narrative shift or telling true, being honest about what family looks like today, getting it right so that when we are creating policies that they're truly reflective of the broad range of families.
And I think, one thing I'd add too is I think we have to be honest about the fact that there is, a good part of this country really does still have an idea that poor people have children to get money without any evidence or understanding of really, no understanding of really what social services look like, or the fact that that's kind of a ridiculous notion on a variety of levels. But I think it is very much built into our entire conversation about welfare. And of course it centers a very specific idea of the sort of welfare queen stereotype. And I think we would be kidding ourselves to think that in mainstream conversation we actually haven't moved beyond that. In the public conversation we have. I think that's actually not, it might be uncouth to sort of say that out loud in this room, but I actually don't think it is in most rooms to make those types of comments. And, in some ways I say that just to put a fine point on it, that shows how far we really have to go. I mean, I will say, just as personal experience, like I have had those conversations with people who, before they know kind of what I do or my politics or anything about me, assume it's fine to say those types of things in front of me, and assume it's fine to say things like, well, the problem in the inner city is that there's no fathers around, and don't understand that there's about 10 totally devastatingly wrong, racist, terrible assumptions underlying that. And it is very hard in moments, and this is why we're trying to really talk about not just tinkering around the edges with rethinking policy, but with really fully shifting a whole paradigm. It's hard to explain, well, first let's talk about the prison industrial complex and how it tears families apart. Then let's talk about income inequality and where there's a divide between how much men and women make and how much women of color make. Then let's talk about how we've created zoning laws and things that sometimes keep parents from living together because they make that beneficial. There's just so many layers to which we've built in these types of barriers to people doing family in smart ways, that once you try to confront one of those very basic kind of misconceptions around why are single mothers getting pregnant if they don't have a father, or why are fathers not in the house, you end up having to give them sort of a 101, structural inequality conversation, which is a very hard one to have. And I think, in my mind, is the argument for a paradigm that's actually about how families are evolving and about how systems are completely insufficient in catching up with families as they are, rather than feeling like we constantly have to be on the defensive, explaining why underneath those very, I think, again, mainstream assumptions are a whole lot of stuff that needs to be debunked.
5 more minutes, and I want to invite everybody else who wants to jump into this conversation. If you wouldn't mind just putting up your table tent like this so we know who's in the queue, and then we can call on you. I mean, there have been a lot of really kind of meaty things that have come up. I mean, a lot of them about fixing our blind spots, right? I mean, fixing our blind spots in our narratives and whose stories we're telling and who gets to tell those stories. I think those blind spots translates into our public policy because of the people who are making those policy decisions and filling that with their own experience and priorities and figuring out how we need to really kind of directly address that process in addition to the narratives that are informing it. I say this all just to buy a little time to see some tent cards go up. So let's go ahead and start here.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for this convening. I've learned so much already, and I'm excited to be here. I just want to add on a personal story to what Nicole shared, because I think that while I agree with all of that, there's an assumption because you're white that people get to say that to you because you're white. And as an immigrant to this country, my family is West Indian, my family that is here, most of them came illegally, most of them are now citizens, they live with multi-generations, most of them making minimum wage jobs. They are part of the subset that we're talking about, but yet coming from a country where there are zero social services, my mother says stuff like that all the time. She is not white, she's not a Black American, but she is not white. Like, the people that she knows closest to her need the right system, and yet she is faced with her own prejudice. So I just want to acknowledge that those things happen in, I'm speaking from a very narrow community of color, right? West Indian immigrant families, but they happen in those conversations too. I mean, I face it all the time. There's a high school near me where there is daycare attached to it. And she's like, oh, those children feel like they can have children because the government is taking care of them. And I'm like, no, that's actually not why they're making those choices, if they're making those choices. And in the theory of care, that's actually where I base the conversation. Who do we actually want to punish? Is it the mother, really? And is it the children? Because that's actually what you're talking about when you say we should take away those benefits from them. So I just want to acknowledge that those kinds of prejudices happen in a lot of households.
Thank you. I'm just thinking about what Bridget said and about childcare being sort of baked into infrastructure, and that progressives have, I think, gotten better at thinking about work-family policies, but we still think about them in like a bucket of work-family or like women's economic policies, and that perhaps we should be pushing the envelope a bit more and thinking about like baking into any infrastructure or jobs package, more work-friendly policies that would benefit all families, whatever they look like.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one more. Everybody who has your tent card up, or anybody else who has kind of thoughts or questions, if you just write them down, we definitely want to circle back and pick this conversation up later, but we need to keep moving through the agenda, so.
She's getting one more comment?
Oh, no, I can wait. Oh, okay. Are you sure?
Finish what you're saying, Rachel.
That was it.
Okay.
So over here, I think this will need to be our last one.
No, it's okay. Hi, Shiva Jain with the AFL-CIO. So this is more of a question, somewhat of a comment. So I wonder if folks have thoughts about the role of religion and religious institutions in just the framing of the family. When I think about who I know who mourns the June Cleaver era, I think of my, excuse me, I think of my mother-in-law who's white evangelical Christian, and how for her gender roles are so tied to faith, and this is actually how God wants you to be. So I guess I kind of put that out there as another factor, and it's not even a specific religion, it's just religion and how she views, her child being in a queer partnership, or all those different factors are really dictated, I think, by faith, and just want to kind of bring that into the table as well.
That's a great question. And I mean, also thinking about, really the other sector of faith communities that are very social justice oriented, and looking at a lot of division that's taking place within, mainline denominations right now about, ordinating LGBT clergy or marriage. And I think that's really an interesting case study in how institutions that do kind of traditionally subscribe to these values kind of transition, right? So I think that would be a really great point for us to pick up later on in the day. Thank you all so much for participating in this. We have 5 minutes to transition to
For
the
real
next
5 minutes.
conversation. A real 5 minutes?
We're going to start in 5 minutes. If you're not here, you're going to miss out. All right. All right, y'all. Your 5 minutes are up. Have a seat. Come back together. All right. As long as you're in the room, that's fine. You don't have to sit down.
Okay, I think they have to turn. Oh, okay. All right, everyone. Please take a seat. We're getting started. Thank you. So I'm just going to get going here as you all, and just so everybody knows, if you are looking for coffee and, like me, desperately upset that there's not a third cup to have or something, there is more coffee coming, and feel free, obviously, you're in this room, just get up and grab some for yourself when it arrives. So we talked, obviously, in that first session about how some of the ways families changed since sort of the post-World War II period particularly, and how our outdated thinking, centered on this idealized middle-class white nuclear family is still embedded in our current laws and policies in a way that really disadvantages a lot of our families. And now what I want to move to is a conversation where I want to ask us to think really expansively and creatively about what a new paradigm across all of our work could look like, assuming a shared goal of supporting families as they really are. And we have a few really amazing featured speakers for this one, and then we'll move more quickly into opening it up for discussion with the whole group. But I want to start with a question for Nancy Polikoff, who's right across from me, which is convenient. Nancy, you make a really compelling argument that marriage should not be the dividing line between relationships that have legal consequences attached to them and those that don't. I would love for you to speak a little bit about why, and to maybe share some examples. And if you could just say a few words about what you would propose it might look like in terms of reforming family law, if we were to recognize the worth of all families and decenter marriage as the most important institution.
Thanks, Nicole, and thanks for inviting me here. I did run out of my house this morning without a copy of my book, so I don't have the visual to show you. But I think what you're asking me to talk about is the argument I developed in Beyond Straight and Gay Marriage, Valuing All Families Under the Law. And so within the LGBT movement, I have been a critique, along with Paula Edelbrick, for decades of the emphasis on marriage, especially as it turned out in its last incarnation to be a battle that was won not on the basis of equality, but on the basis of the supremacy of marriage and the importance of marriage and the way in which that has made it almost impossible for the gay rights movement now to champion the kinds of changes that a lot of us are talking about here and that I support. So I have a very basic premise that is the substitution for marriage being the on-off switch for what counts under the law. And the premise is that we look at the reason why any law exists, and then we decide what relationships should be included within the purview of the law in order to fulfill the purpose of the law. So the best example I can give you of how this has happened already, everyone in this room is familiar with domestic violence statutes that allow victims of domestic violence to go into court and get some kind of protection order. So those laws used to only apply to living together married couples. And none of those laws do today. They apply to unmarried couples and to people in a lot of other intimate circumstances. And that's because the purpose of having those laws was to provide remedies against intimate partner violence as it was really taking place. And so if you kept it limited to marriage, you would have a lot of victims of violence who did not get to access that system. And so it changed in order to meet the purpose. Many of the laws today, and I don't have enough time, obviously, to go through all of them, but many of the laws today that that have an on-off switch of marriage are those that are really designed to compensate for economic dependency and economic independence, interdependency. And so then I think about laws affecting who can sue for wrongful death, or who gets survivor's benefits if somebody dies. And you can see that those laws were designed to compensate for the loss of a wage earner in the home. In most places, marriage is an on-off switch for who can get those benefits and who can bring those causes of action for wrongful death. And yet there are isolated examples, and often they're very isolated, of places that get it right, of places where the standard is economic dependency. Who was dependent upon this person who now is no longer bringing in an income? For such matters as, and I'd like to call on Mia's story about her stepsister. So if you're looking at sick leave policies that allow you to use your sick leave to care for yourself or somebody else who is sick, who would that somebody else be? And I would say in those circumstances, anybody you are living with in an economically or emotionally interdependent relationship should be somebody you should be able to use your sick leave to take care of. There shouldn't need to be, we're not just here talking about marriage or romantic couples, but we are, in fact, we're not focusing on romantic couples at all. We're focusing on the kind of interdependency that is what makes family relationships actually work. So in my book, I go through a whole series of the kinds of issues for which marriage is now an on-off switch. And I think that we can do that in a variety of ways, issue by issue. It is much less efficient than having an on-off switch of marriage. But one of my favorite quotations from a Supreme Court case in the context of constitutional law was the Constitution has higher values than speed and efficiency. And I think justice has higher values than speed and efficiency also, and that if we're looking to do justice to the wide range of families, that's what we need to do. I'll just give one more example. So I'm very proud of the contributions I've made over the last 4 decades to LGBT family law and specifically to LGBT parenting law. And one of the things I participated in making the norm in a lot of states is the ability to adopt in a second parent adoption, the child of someone you are not married to. So it used to be that you could only do a step parent adoption. The only other kind of adoption would require a parent to give up parental rights for somebody else to adopt the child. Unless it was a step parent, that step parent could be added. So to meet the needs of same-sex couples, we managed to achieve second parent adoption in a number of states where that couple doesn't have to be married. I would like to say that with the advent of marriage equality, states that did not have second parent adoption before still don't have second parent adoption, and they just tell those couples to get married, and then they can do step parent adoptions. But I want to suggest, and we have a good model now in California for this, that really if you have a child and you wish to raise that child with another person, and that both of you are going to make the commitment to raise that child together, it shouldn't even have to be a romantic partner, let alone a married person. And there is an example in New York of a gay man and a woman who were very close friends, never romantic partners. That was not relevant at all. And they were able to use the law through an interpretation that a judge was willing to give it to both become the adoptive parents of a child, even though the statute in New York uses the term intimate partner. In California, there's now a statute that basically says you can add a person as an adoptive parent without terminating your parental rights if you agree that that's what you want to do. And of course, there has to be a home study that shows it's in the best interest of the child, but it doesn't limit who it can be. And I'd like to call on the work of Angela Capenda, who's a law professor at Mississippi College of Law, who wrote over 20 years ago a law review article on joint adoption by African American friends and co-community people of children, basically saying if we want to get more homes for African American children who don't have homes, we should let two people join together to adopt the child when perhaps neither one alone would feel like they needed to do that. So that's another place. And if I can just say one more thing about the project I'm working on now, in the hopes that maybe somebody in this room wants to talk to me about it. So, and it is about same-sex couples raising children. So African American same-sex couples are 2.5 times more likely than white same-sex couples to be raising children. 41% of same-sex African American couples are raising children. 16% of white same-sex couples are raising children. That is not what we usually see. African American same-sex couples are raising children with greatly economically disadvantaged circumstances. And the other disproportionate rate we know is that African American children are almost twice as likely to wind up in the foster care system as white children. And so I'm trying to look at the intersection of these two terrible statistics, especially to look at the so-called child welfare system inability to recognize who a child's parents are, and perhaps not seeing the fact that a child coming into that system has another parent from a same-sex relationship. And I have many stories of where this has happened and been really tragic for that child and that family, and that's my current work on families.
Thank you, Nancy. I'd love to ask us all to keep in mind that sort of general framework as one of the sort of big ideas. I think it's sort of interesting through all of our work to explore. Jared, I want to move on to you because your work has actually focused on implementing new, more inclusive definitions of family in policy and practice. And if you could just talk a little bit about the your major efforts, and then particularly what you've learned along the way in terms of really what the best arguments for expanded family recognition are. And if you could also talk a little bit about the nature of resistance to those efforts so we understand what that looks like.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. So I work at a Better Balance. We're a legal advocacy organization focused on work-family issues, including paid leave, which we're deeply involved in. The legal work around paid sick time and paid family and medical leave. And we have a joint project that I started with Family Values at Work, which is an umbrella of 25 state coalitions working on these issues as well. And we created a project to really focus on the importance using paid leave as an entry point to expanding recognition of all types of families. And we've been involved at a few different levels in this work. We created what's called the Family Justice Network. Many of you are members, but it's about 30 national groups representing LGBTQ, work family, labor, economic and racial justice, aging groups, focused on how we can collaborate. And one area that's really emerged has been expanding recognition of all types of families through workplace leave. And then we've been very involved in terms of technical assistance to state and local campaigns working on paid leave. And that's taken many forms, from the drafting, and we have a detailed guide to how to define family inclusively in workplace leave laws. Lots of fact sheets, talking points, tons of tools. And then, one other important piece of this, and I think some of the success that I'll talk about, is we've also made regrants available to state and local coalitions, now in 8 states, to really dig in on the ground in terms of advancing paid leave bills that recognize families of all types through an LGBTQ-focused lens, but more broadly. So just a couple of pieces in response to that question on the success that we've had. So last year we passed 5 paid sick time laws that cover family using our model definition that covers chosen family, no biological or legal relationship necessary, but essentially if someone is family to you, they're covered in your ability to use paid sick time. And so we've won that in St. Paul, Minnesota, the state of Arizona, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Cook County, Illinois. And then in addition, President Obama's executive order for federal contractors and paid sick time also used the same definition. So, that, of course, was very exciting, and just a few threads to pull out from some of this work. Sure. So the definition, it's been a little different. We've used a model from the federal workforce definition for federal workers' own right to leave. Interestingly, goes back to the Vietnam War, and I worked on a report with Kate from CAP on this. And our thought is that it was originally in terms of bereavement leave for federal workers to be able to use their time for other service members, is what we think in terms of the timing, why it developed. It's been expanded over the years to where it was in the 90s, went to use of all sick time for federal workers. So that is the right that federal workers have right now to use sick time, and it's language around blood or affinity, and the ability if someone has a relationship that is so close it's equivalent to family, they're covered. And we've used this definition and tinkered with it in different places, but it's the model that we've built on. And so that's kind of the model definition, but I think one important piece of this is that we know we're not going to win this everywhere. So the guide that we developed on how to draft family definitions includes a lot of fallbacks that maybe are narrower, but still would be a big advance. So Minnesota, I think, is one good example where there was a coalition really committed to fighting for this. In Minneapolis, through the legislative process, they started with this definition, had some pushback in terms of this is too broad, this is just going to open the door to fraud, things that we hear and can refute in terms of paid leave more broadly. But they were able, through a compromise, not to win that definition, but one that allows workers in Minneapolis to use their sick time for all household members. And this was a model that was important to the coalition because of immigrant families in Minneapolis, and some of the coalition members working on immigration issues said this is really important to immigrant families in Minneapolis. But then they turned to St. Paul and were able to win it there. So, in terms of fallbacks, I think that it's just an important piece that there are these other options. Arizona was interesting because, it's a redder state. It was a ballot initiative for paid sick time and minimum wage. There was some coalition reluctance. This is kind of a new frontier. How much pushback is there going to be? And both labor partners from UFCW and Arizona's statewide equality group really said this is a priority for us. It stayed in. There really wasn't much pushback, and they were able to win paid sick time overwhelmingly in November with this definition. and are now using it for CBAs. For the union groups that were involved are now expanding their own family definitions in their contracts, which has been exciting. And then just to close, I think 2 other examples that are really interesting. One is Georgia, where they were able to win what we call a kin care bill, so not paid sick time, but the ability to use your sick time if you receive it to care for family members. A few years back, it was a fairly narrow definition, Republican-sponsored bill, and there was a lot of discussion within the coalition about how can we advance this in a state that is fairly conservative. It has Republican sponsors, and they ended up using a tax-dependent definition, which is maybe not the model definition that we would use in terms of being the most inclusive, but was something that all of the coalition members, including Georgia Equality, were really excited about as a first step. They were able to win that. It passed. It was signed by Governor Deal just a month or 2 ago. And they're now using that as a building block to address family in other areas. And that's one of the re-grants that I mentioned, is they're doing a road show called the Typical American Families exhibit, where they're talking about what families actually look like, using this kind of as a springboard, and collecting stories, because stories are so important in terms of the ability to win this. And then the last thing that I'll mention is, we're working on building these paid sick time wins now into the context of paid family leave, more extended time off, which is another step. It's harder when we're not talking about 5 or 7 days, but up to 12 weeks. And we did in New York, where I'm based and was heavily involved in the paid family leave campaign there, a definition that includes the ability to take, it'll be up to 12 weeks when fully phased in, of paid family leave to care for a seriously ill family member that includes unmarried couples. And it's a chosen family style definition of domestic partner that really is the first type of statewide protection like this in New York. So we're really excited to now use this as something to incorporate into other legislation in New York as a first big win.
Jared, can you just say one word about the nature of the resistance piece? Because I know you've told me some interesting things that you've heard as you've moved through this work, and I think those are almost as illuminating as anything else.
Yeah, so we started this work before nationwide marriage equality. It started with kind of an LGBTQ lens. And it was not really, I think, that surprising, but stepping back and realizing it was harder to do this in states that already had marriage equality. And we were hearing, and we're still hearing, in states legislators who are very supportive, but saying, we have marriage equality, why do we need this definition now? So I think the pushback comes sometimes from very supportive legislators in terms of paid leave, but might not see the importance of this now that we have marriage equality, because I do think that was some of the lens that this work started in. So the importance of being able to say, this is not just an LGBTQ issue. It is, certainly, when you look at chosen family and within the community, but really the need to incorporate all types of family stories to be able to address kind of that resistance even from some partners.
Right. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that's an important piece, sort of the idea that we're funneling, our go-to now can be to funnel everybody else into the marriage channel rather than to think about the half of the adults in this country who aren't married, which is, in some ways the more obvious way to do it, but also doesn't have a pre-existing structure around it. Okay, Fatima. I have a lot of questions for you, but I'll keep this brief. So we know that the families that are often most stigmatized, both I think on the cultural front, but also within our policies, are made up of low-income folks, LGBTQ headed households headed by women of color and immigrants, obviously a lot of single mothers. I'm just curious what you think the impact of our current policies, or I should probably say, or lack thereof current policies, is on them. And And then I'd love to ask you to think beyond what is feasible in this very moment, because I know obviously we don't want to pretend that that given our current president, there's much gonna, that anything federal is really on the table right now that's very exciting. But thinking sort of beyond that, what efforts do you think would most improve the lives of the families I just mentioned most significantly?
Great. Thanks, Nicole. And I'm really excited to be here today because this framework is a really interesting way to think about the stigma that is embedded in our laws and policies around unmarried women broadly. And so it's an interesting approach for me to think about, because we're in a situation where there's both a stigma embedded in the law, or the laws and policies just ignore the fact that unmarried people exist, and so it doesn't match the reality of lives or the demographic realities that Stephanie Kuntz outlined. And it's also at the same time a situation where some of our laws and policies make it harder, especially for families of color who want to be together, whether the family reunification laws in the foster system, or the realities right now of our large-scale immigration raids, or the criminalization of brown and black people, that is a sort of an extra layer that, again, ignores that there are brown and black families. If I think about if we start just with some of the workplace issues, that all of the inequalities that women who are working in the workplace face tend to be compounded for certain populations, particularly, and I'll talk just a little bit about moms who are unmarried. And some of that is that if you just think about wages, our policies are based on the idea that you have two people working. That's how you can justify a federal minimum wage that hasn't been raised in a decade at $7.25, or the tip credit that is just absurd. And the wages that match up with women-dominated fields, especially those that are disproportionately women of color, some of the lowest paid fields. So, if you look at some of our lowest wage jobs, whether you're talking about childcare work or home care work or retail or restaurants or other service jobs, and which are disproportionately women of color, and we're also in this situation where there's a now almost radical idea of having a $15 minimum wage. We finally have that introduced at the federal level. We should all just cheer, but even that's not actually a living wage if you were sort of on your own and raising multiple children. And so the wages are really based on the fact that there's going to be multiple people providing income. And then in many of the lowest paid jobs, they lack the sort of flexibility or family support policies that are truly necessary for families to both be working and living together, and whether that's the unpredictable work hours of which people have little control, or what happens when you have work absences for to take care of sick family, or to just do as I have to do on Monday, which is show up at 1 o'clock for my kid's school presentation on all of his writing for the year in 3rd grade. Like, that's a big deal. I have to be there. It's at 1 o'clock, right? So all of it's sort of baked in a way that doesn't account for, again, the demographic realities that we know. And then when you add that the laws don't protect for the family structures that really exist, or that really make it possible for people, what real family is, that make it possible for real family to make it possible for individuals to work and care. And so whether that is the related or not aunts, cousins, extended family who make up our modern structures. And then even before getting to work, now I can't remember who made the point earlier about the child care center tied to the school. But when I think about the sort of real and deep stigma that our very young parents face, and the young moms in particular face, that, that stigma is about, why are you in school at all? Because, pregnancy and parenting is contagious at a certain age, apparently. And certainly we don't want to make it easy for you. We don't, because if we make it easy for you, if you have childcare, or if you don't have to go 5 different places to get the supports that you need, or if there's actual transportation that makes it possible for you to get your child somewhere and attend school, then everybody's going to want to get pregnant. And so for our very youngest families, there's this additional stigma. And then there's the child care piece. And not only for infant and toddlers, which is where most of the conversation around childcare is finally getting, but also if you are parenting by yourself, or primarily parenting by yourself, you need a full day. And even for older children, you have to think about what happens after school, what happens when I work nights, what happens on the weekends. And so our laws largely don't really, in many places, account for that. And even where we have the child care assistance grants, most of the eligible children actually don't get it, right? So 5 of the 6 children who are eligible for child care assistance now don't get it. It's grossly underfunded. And so we have like a little bit of a system in place that doesn't meet the need. And the broader system, we haven't yet had the imagination to develop the broader system that actually would begin to meet the child care needs for more. I'm going to say 2 more things, because I know I'm talking long, but I had also been just thinking about where we had won historically a couple of times along the way was in the tax code. And so I was interested because this sort of dependent care, you could see how you get there in a state that's conservative, and that's sort of a historical model that we have used to drive additional dollars to families, to drive additional support for child care. And there's this, and during the Trump administration's campaign, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about him, but during the campaign, they had proposed getting rid of the head of household filing status, which was like a sort of secret way to give more dollars to mostly single moms. So, the current tax policy that's out there is so bare bones, we have no idea whether they're actually proposing that or not. But the tax code had been a place to try to be sneaky a little bit and creative and get more dollars. But it didn't really do, and it doesn't really do what you guys are trying to do here, which is sort of shift an entire narrative around family. So I get that there's trade-offs around the tinkering to get dollars to people fast, with that, when you're not sort of disrupting this whole stigma. And then the last thing that I'm going to say, and then I'll pause, because I think you had a second part of your question. I don't think I've answered it. But that is around this same sort of stigma and shame around families. It also shows up in our reproductive health care access generally. And it means, because of that stigma, that women don't always get the care that they need. It means that care isn't always accessible. And so the solution in the Affordable Care Act that we came up with was that here are a list of preventative care services, so that you didn't have to have a debate about stigma and like, do you really need it, and are you married, and like that wasn't the debate. It was like doctors and experts and scientists will list the care you need, and then you have to give it without cost sharing. And so many of you probably have been watching around this leaked rule, which sort of puts back in some of the issues around not just religion and people being able to say, well, it's against my religion, and having your boss being able to deny contraception, but also moral, like the idea that I have moral objections to you having the care that you need. And so that is inserting again where we had, on purpose tried, let's not have a debate around whether or not someone is worthy of care, and they are trying to sort of insert that. So I'll pause there, and if there's a follow-up, I can.
Thank you. And you actually said something that is a perfect transition for a question I want to ask you, Cecilia, which is, you talked about sort of the paradigm shift versus tinkering, or sort of, sort of big changes versus small changes when we think about creating sort of a whole new policy landscape that actually radically rethinks what our expectations of our family should be. And Cecilia, as somebody who's spent time, obviously, in government, as the director of the Domestic Policy Council under Obama, and obviously has worked in advocacy, I'm just curious if you could talk about the tension that I think we all know exists in the room between sort of around how much political capital to expend pushing ideas are clearly cutting edge and clearly feel like they might be long shots. Because I think a piece I want to bring into this conversation in general is that, there's a lot of there's a lot of smart people and interesting ideas in this room, and it's very easy for us to all kind of throw our hands up and say, yeah, but will we ever decenter marriage as the dividing, as sort of the bright line in our policies? Will we ever really be able to have a blood or affinity or chosen family definition? And I just want you to think through with us a little what it means to think about both those things aspirationally that we want and some of the political realities that we face.
Yes, so thank you. And thanks to all of you for this. This is really a great conversation. So I address this from the perspective of somebody in a policymaking role in an administration that was largely friendly to the sets of issues that everybody has surfaced here. And being friendly to it doesn't necessarily always mean that you have the tools to move it forward, although in some cases, and I thank you for noting that the executive order, in some cases you're able to make progress in a way which is visible and which is substantial. Even on things which are cutting edge and which may be further than states and localities are able to go or are willing to go. But frankly, those are rare. And it's really fun when you're able to do it, and you don't really get to do it often enough. I found as a policymaker what I was frequently looking for from folks that were coming at us to make these kinds of changes was help with the tools to help us make the argument internally. And by internally, I mean both sort of within the federal family, since that's where I was sitting, but also you sort of have to start with your friends on the Hill. Like, can you get, if you're a Democratic administration, can you get the Democrats there with you to stand up and support what it is that you're putting forward? Like, if you can't pass that barrier, then it's really hard to get something done, even if it's not a legislative proposal. And then if you're sort of past that hurdle, can you make the argument sufficient so that there are other friends or folks who aren't necessarily friends but willing to make the case, who see it as in their interest. And frequently we found that the best way to do that was not always to start with this sort of the policy analysis and data that you absolutely need in order to be able to make the case, but that which ultimately is frequently, especially when you're asking people to kind of absorb an idea which may be new to them, the data and the analysis is really important, but it's often not sufficient. And the thing which frequently tips the balance is being able to tell stories, as several folks have already indicated today, that being able to illustrate the connections that we're talking about is tremendously important to help people, and even people who want to be able to get there, but who may not start with the same understanding that you start with, but who also need that set of tools to then persuade the other people they need to be persuading internally to get a policy moving forward. So to give you an example just of an occasion where we worked hard to think through what kind of story was actually going to be impactful in an internal conversation about, as we were wrestling with the fact that what a family gets in a typical month from the SNAP program, from the food stamp program, is usually insufficient to feed a family. And there's all kinds of really interesting and heartbreaking data about people who get hospitalized with blood sugar issues at the end of the month because their food stamps have run out, or what happens to children's performance in school at the end of the month because food has run out in the family, or quite literally calculations of like how much cabbage you would have to eat in the course of a month, or beans, in order to sort of make the money stretch as far, or make the benefit stretch as far as it needs to stretch. Like, I would think we calculated that a family would have to eat 14 times as much cabbage as the average American family in order to survive on this benefit, which seems unlikely, or that you would need to spend, that the benefit is calculated with the expectation that you would spend 45 minutes cooking, which when my children were at home, there was not a weekday when anybody spent 45 minutes cooking. What we learned was that the way to tell the story ultimately was not using the examples that I just gave you, which I found really compelling as a policymaker, but that we learned that actually the place to start is to talk about the impact on kids, and that is actually the entry point, and particularly the piece about what happens to kids' performance in school is the entryway to then allow you to expand the story and get to the analysis and the data, which helps bolster the case. So the diversity of stories, the quality of stories, the ability to hand people stories to tell in order to get a policy moving forward turns out to be at least as important as the data and analysis, and maybe more so. And frequently, if that story can start with the impact on kids, you can bust through a lot of barriers that would otherwise have an impact on the conversation that you're trying to have. A second thing that we did frequently was to start from outside of the lens of family policy. And to give you an example, which just came up again in my life very recently, we spent a lot of time thinking about, frankly, since we weren't going to get very much out of Congress, what you could get out of the levers that we had in the federal agencies. And we spent a lot of time with the Secretary of Transportation, who was very amenable to these sets of issues, thinking about, like, do we have levers in transportation policy in the way that we were looking at levers all over the federal government? And ended up putting forward, quietly but importantly, a set of standards for transportation grants where essentially localities could sort of bolster their grant applications if they were able to demonstrate how what they were asking to build with these transportation dollars would address equality of opportunity and would address people's ability to get from home to work or home to childcare. And just this week I was in Indianapolis, where they're very excited about a rapid bus transit couple of avenues that they're opening up with money that came out of the Department of Transportation in the Obama administration, where in fact they're connecting local neighborhoods, with through transportation with areas that give people better access to jobs, and that is a legitimate use of transportation funds and transportation policy if you're designing it correctly. And it's important to kind of get creative and look at side doors and back doors and other channels for advancing these kinds of policy objectives, because there are, and in some ways this was the result of the creativity that was foisted upon us by having a fairly useless Congress, that really forced us to look at other avenues to try to make things happen. And that is, I think, a really important set of tools for the advocacy world to be thinking about. And then the third is sort of, again, on the theme of creativity, to look at other opportunities. So to use family leave as an example, we were obviously, with the exception of the contracting policy, we weren't successful in getting Congress to do what we wanted them to do with respect to sick days or family leave. And this happened on early childhood education, this happened on the minimum wage, on like a lot of things where the administration put forward, proposals that I'm quite proud of in the budget and fought for them in Congress and frankly failed to get much traction in Congress. We spent a tremendous amount of energy taking those conversations around the country. And I like to think that the work that Secretary Perez did, for example, or that the president or my colleagues like Valerie Jarrett did on the Lead on Leave campaign that took them all around the country contributed to the progress that we were able to make in cities, in particular companies, and even in some states, where we made some progress, where the debate, the conversation at least advanced, and in some cases policies advanced. And look, the theory of the case there was if you can take the conversation around the country and build momentum around the minimum wage, around paid leave, around some of these other ideas, that ultimately those become standards which find their way back to Washington and frankly shame policymakers in Congress to get where the rest of the country has already gotten. And then to give you just one last example, we spent a lot of time thinking about, and I'm terrible with names, and so I sadly cannot remember the authors of the book, $2 a Day. Can anyone name them? Thank you. Thank you very much. And apologies. But, you know, we agonized over this information and trying to figure out, and this came out around the last year of the administration, like, you know, we don't have great tools, but like we're the ones in the government. How do we lift this up? How do we, can we begin to devise proposals which address the fact that this huge number of families and huge number of children are living in families that have sort of cash resources of less than $2 a day, which is, you know, poverty anywhere in the world. And, you know, we did what you do. You come up with a budget proposal in a budget that everybody knew wasn't going anywhere, but provides a marker, hopefully, for somebody to build on. We looked at the food stamp program and the question of diapers, right? Because food stamps don't provide access to diapers, and none of the federal safety net programs really provide access to diapers. And again, like, you need Congress to pass legislation in order to break that open, but we created, again, in the budget, a small pilot program that could begin to get you there. But importantly, knowing that those were markers, we went to the private sector on the diaper question, right? We compiled all of this data about how much more low-income families pay for diapers compared to middle-income or upper-income families, because they're more likely to get them at the store on the corner, which has, you know, 5 diapers in a package, and you spend 3 times as much. And you don't have access to, you know, I used to get mine at Costco, where I have a membership, and my younger colleagues, you know, have memberships and with retailers that it's essentially a membership through the internet, and they get boxes delivered to their doors, which isn't necessarily available. It requires a membership fee. It requires living in a place where you can get packages delivered. So we took that to the private sector and essentially convinced both the distributor and a manufacturer to take this on, and they've essentially figured out a way to package the same diapers that they were selling differently in order to reduce the costs. And then made them available at cost, at a very, very reduced cost compared to what everybody else pays for them, to any nonprofit in the country. And the end result of that has been now the numbers in the tens of millions of diapers that have been made available to diaper banks and to other nonprofits, which is, again, it's not a federal policy. I wish it were, but it's not nothing. And what it did was reflect, frankly, just the application of creativity to some of these questions and some of these goals in order to at least to move us forward in what I think are some interesting and important ways. So I hope those provide lessons both for, you know, folks who will become policymakers themselves if we can ever get an administration which is interested in talking and thinking about these questions. But also I think of them as also tools in the advocacy community, which is really the world that I come from. That it's important to make the case in the way that we've made the case. It's important to make it as human as possible, and tell compelling stories to help get policymakers there. But it's also just really, especially in moments like this, it's really important to get creative and find, you know, the occasional side door and back door to get things done for the families and the people that we're talking about.
Thank you, Phil. That was really interesting. I just want to pull out a few themes and then open this up for discussion. I mean, I heard some really sort of interesting and also, you know, devastating things for a lot of us who traffic in data and information and facts, which is, you know, one that stories ultimately sometimes matter more, at least when it comes to policymakers, than bringing all the data. And as people in the world who work with data, I'm just curious, you know, I think a lot about, I'm very familiar with a lot of the work that the Council on Contemporary Families have done, which is where Virginia Rutter, Philip, Stephanie's from, and they've debunked a lot of the worst policies around kind of marriage promotion, or, you know, a lot of sort of what doesn't work, and yet, you know, some of those ideas are still pervasive. I want to put this out there to everybody. We sort of, first of all, we know what doesn't work, right? We have a really great sense of all the things that are failing us. And we have a good sense of, on at least among the political right, this sort of sense that there is a heyday of families that's behind us that we should go back to. Do all of you, and you can answer as much as just human beings in the world as your expertise, because I think this is one of the big questions, but do we know what the vision is for people, what the alternative way to do family looks like? Do you think people understand in this country, if my path is not that I necessarily am ever going to have a lot of money, if my path is not necessarily that I am a person who's going to be first married and then have a child, biological child, and then raise that child with a married partner in a lifelong marriage, do people understand what a good vision looks like that's in front of us and not behind us? And that's a big question, so. And also, I should say, reactions to all of the big ideas that just came up here today.
Go ahead, Brandy.
Yeah. Brittany or Brandy?
Brittany, I mean, I'm
Okay.
sorry. I was thinking about
Yeah.
Brandy and looking at Brittany.
Thank y'all. I'm Brittany Cooper. I have a couple of questions about this related to that is connected to Nicole's final comment. One, when we say, will we ever decenter marriage? And then at the same time we say that the stories we must tell are stories about children. What about those of us who have no children? I'm a family of one. And I'm part of a generation of very high achieving Black women who have a whole sort of partner conundrum, right? And so, but because we are high achieving, our paychecks get used to fund other people's families, both our own and then because of the tax structure, other American families, right? And so, and there's a narrative around that says that women who would even ask that question are being selfish, right? And so I wonder, in a world where people only care about family stories if they're around children, then we don't even have the ability to hear that we're part of a country that has an increasing number of single people. And so who are building families in other ways, right? Related to that, as I'm listening to folks talk about policy, one of the tensions that I feel is around, is there a way to shift policy in a way that's amenable to families without reinforcing carcerality and state regulation? Right, because when I think about working class Black families, part of the resistance, so like when you think about welfare policy, right? So if you think about it as a policy that was meant to help white families and then becomes punitive for Black families, many of the policies that exist to help families also mean that those families have to have a formal relationship to the government. Means that how they're defining family and the ways that they need to advocate for themselves then becomes subject to scrutiny. And if you're in a history where people are already sort of demonized and where there's a sort of fundamental anti-Blackness, right, built into how we think about welfare policy or any kind of family well-being policy, then that necessarily means that if folks are already suspicious of your kind, then if they make policies that are amenable to you, then they want to regulate who gets it. As a story point that is generally related, I remember after Hurricane Katrina that I was out doing one of these charity things where where we were folding up clothes that had been donated to send to families who had been displaced. And a lovely white woman said, well, these clothes are probably so much better than the clothes that they already had, right? And I thought, it wasn't just about a sort of perception, but also a regulation of the people who were going to get the items, right? Whether they were worthy, right? Whether these handouts that were being given to them, whether they had earned the sort of kindness that was being offered. And that regulatory impulse also undergirds policy. It doesn't just happen at the level of philanthropy and charity. And so I wonder about, when we do all of this work around policy, are we dealing with the fact that when we regulate people's relationship to the state, some of us have a fundamentally violent relationship to the state? And so then what do we do?
Excellent questions. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, everyone. I love this conversation, and particularly this panel, because we're thinking about how we can stretch
this notion of family. And I just want to kind of extend what Brittany said a bit. If we're thinking about this notion of not necessarily being partnered, not necessarily being parents, and we extend that a bit further, we talked a bit about leave, right? And so you might be able to get leave to take care of an extended family member. It can be a parent, can be a sibling. But what do we do when we think about all the people who are supporting extended family members? So coming from that same kind of group of high-achieving Black women who are not necessarily partnered, who don't necessarily have children, we are all starting from negative because we were already taking care of our families when we went into college. There's nothing that accounts for that, right? And so if we think about the way that the kind of remittances get captured, if we're thinking about families of immigration, we don't have something that's equivalent for people who are paying for, have been supporting, will continue to support family members, that is siblings, that is parents, that's nieces and nephews in extended care for different varieties of family. How can we begin to bring them into the kind of policy formation, thinking about what Rachel said earlier about the tax code and how a lot of the things that you get from the tax code are invisible, that allow you to do more to stretch that money, but if you're not partnered, if you're not married, if you don't have children, that never even comes into consideration. And so how can we think about that notion of those of us who are, Chris Marsh at the University of Maryland talks about this notion of single and living alone. Where do we come into the conversation?
It's a great point. And I just want to be attentive to time. We only have about 5 minutes left, and I know that's not enough. I want to mention that, first of all, write down your questions. And the whole point of how way do we design this day was have the final hour of the day be us workshopping these ideas. So don't worry, keep them in your head. They're not going anywhere. We're going to have time to talk about them. Some of you put yours down, and I was going, do you still want to say a word? I was going to defer to. Oh, okay. Well, I see Lisa and I see Nancy, and I know, let's start with you two. Nancy, let's start with you and then move to Lisa, Guide, and then if everybody's really quick, we can leave time for you, Vicki and Fatima. Thanks.
So for the last couple of comments, I'm glad you mentioned the tax code, also Social Security. So right now, the tax code privileges single earner married couples, and so does Social Security. Right now, single earner married couples pay less into Social Security and get more out of it than anybody else does. And if you've ever cared for a family member, I have a cousin who cared for her mother for decades, but when her mother died, she didn't get Social Security benefits based on that. If she had been a wife and had done it, she would have gotten Social Security benefits. So that system is absolutely set up to privilege one kind of family, and in theory, could be changed. I do want to say something about kids, though, which is that, so children are inevitable dependents, in the term coined by Martha Feynman, that they need care. They cannot take care of themselves. And yet, another one of the examples I talk about is, in almost all of the country, you cannot disinherit your spouse, but you can disinherit your children. Like, how is that justice? It used to be men had no obligation to support a child who wasn't born to their wife. It used to be there was no divorce. And so if you had children you were liable to support, they were likely living with your wife. And so when your wife inherited, she would take care of your children. None of that is what family looks like today. None of that is what children look like today. And yet we still have a law that says you do not have to leave anything, even to minor children. And yet your wife, even if you were married, 6 months ago, is entitled to, in many places, a very large share that you cannot disinherit.
Yeah.
We could change those laws.
Really interesting point. Lisa, final.
So, this is a great conversation. I wanted to, Cecilia talked about entry point policy, and you referred directly to, you referred directly to policy that would help young
education policy that would help young mothers. And I was reminded of a study that IWPR did that we had supported, that when we were trying to get paid sick leave law in Colorado, and we determined that without paid sick leave for parents, typically the older girls in the family, teenage girls, would have to stay home to take care of younger children, and they would miss significant amounts of school. And it's actually quantifiable in terms of their performance in school because they had to stay home. So I think about like that on a macro level, and about what Andrea said earlier on working these kinds of policies into what are the entry points at a national level. Whether putting the policies in infrastructure or jobs bills, and I think about no less than Janet Yellen saying a couple weeks ago about how if we had the same employment rate of women in the United States as they do in Western Europe, our GDP would grow by 5 or 6% immediately. And how this kind of idea that women are 51% of the population in our country, but yet anything that benefits them is on the side and not core to the economic future of the country, it's something I just think about a lot, about how do we make these policies core to a broad economic message that benefits the country as a whole.
Thank you. And I think what we'll do is we're going to wrap now, and we're going to move without a break. If you want to stand up and just stretch and move your body, that's fine, but we're going to stay in the room. And I'm going to pass this off to Family Stories co-director Mia Birdsong to take us through our final moderated conversation of the day. And once we're done with that, just so everybody knows, then we will have a break for lunch, and our final part of the day is a workshop, which is all sort of discussion.
Thank you. So I'm going to almost immediately pass it off to Brittany. Brittany, so we're going to talk about the Moynihan Report and its legacy. And I want us to be mindful of shifting into a positive aspirational space as well as we're having this conversation. But Brittany, can you kind of help us get all on the same page around what the Moynihan Report is and the work that Black women were doing pre-Moynihan to address some of the issues that the report focused on?
Sure. So the Moynihan Report is drafted by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the spring of '65. It has become an infamous report because of a couple of arguments that are made about Black women. But one of the things to say as preamble to that is that really the report is stunning in its clarity about the devastation that America's long history of racial injustice had done to Black families. So the challenge of the Moynihan Report is that it is one of the most cogent structural arguments about the government's responsibility around racism that I've ever seen. It lays out this history, and it keeps on saying, because of the damage that white people did to Black people, this is why they are in this position. We would not dare get any kind of clarity like that from any governmental official in this country today. And so I'm reading the Moynihan Report, and as I have revisited it, one of the things that is stunning is that it has this level of structural clarity about the cause of the problem. And then it says, but its conclusion is just so far askew. It just says, so then the problem is family structure. And it's like, well, how did we arrive there? If the problem is economics, if the problem is racial violence, if the problem is lack of employment, and the problem is the educational system, then how is it that having women at the head of the family is really the thing that you want to ameliorate? So because I'm a historian of Black women thinkers, one of the things that I also think is really important to say that I find to be very devastating about the Moynihan Report in the moment that it comes out is that it doesn't just, so that, the key conclusions of the Moynihan Report, as we know, is that it says that the real problem with the, quote, Negro family is that it has a matriarchal rule, right, that Black women are the head of Black families. A quarter of Black families at that point had female-headed households. Today, that number is 70%. And then it says, so this is a tangle of pathology that affects every part of Black children's lives. And in particular, it is most concerned about Black men and boys' lives, right? So it says that while the girls are doing just fine, they have educational achievement, they're not really struggling, it's the boys who lose their way. Now, I mean, because I am kind of crunk, I would just point out that we heard that argument again from our beloved former administration in the form of the My Brother's Keeper argument. That was the fundamental argument. We're just going to help the boys because the boys are the ones who are affected by this terrible racist structure. The girls, I mean, we don't really know what's going on with them, but we assume that they're fine, right? So that argument continues to be at the core of even liberal policy offerings around how you ameliorate racial justice in Black communities. It's very interesting. So, but my thing about the sort of devastation of the Moynihan Report, so prior to 1965, really since 1865, Black women thinkers had been the key theorists of the Black family. They saw the Black family unit as this expansive creative force that by virtue of the sort of structures of enslavement did not look nuclear in any way, right? This is where we get the term fictive kinship. So if you had been caretaking for someone during the period of enslavement, then you just brought them with you into freedom. It could be your cousin, it could just be somebody who happened to go through this experience with you, but you saw a responsibility to them and they became family. And that is why today, Black people still have play cousins. Black people still have, you know, I mean, when I try to describe my family to people, you know, I'm like, well, so there's, you know, my second cousin lives with my mom, you know, who is her great aunt, and then my play sister. And, you know, it's like, and it minimizes it, but these are people who are entitled to resources, who come to family events, who when we are talking about caretaking, we take care of them. There's a history for that is this sort of expansive unit around family. So the reason that I say that is because Black women have been the most creative and expansive thinkers about what families ought to look like, because they've had a very functional analysis of family that is actually not rooted in faith as evangelical as Black people sometimes are, right? Black people's notion of family coming out of the period of enslavement is this should be a unit where you can be sustained, where you will make sure that you get a good meal, where you will be kept safe, where you will have somewhere to go for holidays, and a place to connect to a notion of home, right, and security. So I'm saying that part of what Black women theorists of the family teach us is that if we want to have a more expansive definition of what families are, then we should think about what the function of families is, right? And then any sort of configuration that allows us to achieve that works in Black America, right? Even if people have feelings about the publicity around it, in functionality, this is what they do. My folks, my stepdad is a Baptist preacher. My people are as conservative as they come around notions of nuclear families. But in action, it doesn't look that way at all. So if you ask them, they would tell you something conservative, but in practice, they are doing something that looks entirely more expansive than that. So in 1965, when the Moynihan Report is released, what is devastating is that it absolutely eviscerates all of those decades of thinking and theorizing from Black women about how you create structures that are sustainable for Black lives and Black thriving. So in the 1890s, in the early 1900s, Black women, largely the National Association of Colored Women, they have these conferences every 2 years. They're concerned with how can we get Black kids into kindergartens. They start some of the first kindergartens for any children in major cities around the country. They ask a lot about, like, how can we make sure that Black mothers know about proper sanitation, about health concerns? They're having a robust debate about whether we should spank children. This is in the early 1900s. Many club women were like, it injures them, it's traumatic, don't do it. So this narrative that Black folks are all about the sort of spanking narrative, it's always been a more dynamic and robust conversation, right? But largely, Black women are like, well, how can we create a society in which Black people have everything they need to live and thrive? So Black women, they don't just create a family structure. In post-Reconstruction, when the government abandons Black folks, Black women say, well, we have to create a social safety net. So we're creating schools, hospitals, libraries, nursing homes, daycare centers, or kindergartens, and also domestic training schools. So they literally create an entire social services safety net for Black folks in order to take care of them at every stage of their lives. And then what happens during Moynihan is that it doesn't just say that Black mothers are pathological and that Black heads of household are pathological. It also makes the argument then that since we have arrived at this moment where we have allowed Black women to sort of create a family structure that looks this way, and it is now the source of pathology, that the way Black women think about families is fundamentally wrong and antithetical to Black people's ability to achieve the American dream. That is the real tragedy of Moynihan, is that it robs Black women of agency at every level. It says that Black women's thinking about families as being more expansive is wrong, and then it says that the way that Black women execute the care of Black families is wrong, right, and pathological, and that it in particular fundamentally harms Black men. And so one of the challenges then for us as we think about how to build creative families is to realize that if you actually look at the Moynihan report, what it tells us is that you should follow how Black women have thought about families. And I recognize that that feels a little strident, and it's sort of like an inversion argument, but that's cool. I'm okay with inversion arguments, right? So that when you look at the state of Black women, so now literally everything that we're saying that white women, single mothers do that is creative, we saw Black women doing it 50 years ago. And we called it pathological then, right? And so we want to think about what it actually means to sustain a new kind of American family. The people who have always been building creative family structures in the midst of a sort of continual societal upheaval have been Black women. They're the folks who've always had to respond to a broken system that doesn't serve them and then create something that works. And so we actually do have a model for the kinds of things that we want to do around thinking around the creative ways that Black women think about families. And what's happening is that a lot of this conversation is sort of rooted in the inherent intellectual labor that Black women have given to families, and given to family structures without giving them credit. Right, and so Black women have said forever that, yeah, you actually can raise Black families that can live and thrive, and you don't need a man to do it. And here's how, and that means that you get into the workforce, you leave the baby with your mama, you live close by your family members, y'all all live in the house together, right? And then there is built-in child care. This is why, Black folks try to live in close proximity to families. That also gets disrupted by the Great Migration and by economic concerns, but it's also why so one of the last thing I'll say is one of the things Moynihan is responding to is that they keep saying when Black families leave the South, they're in disarray because they come north and they can't stay together. So part of what they're pointing to is that the thing that sustained Black families in the midst of a racially repressive regime is that they figured out a sort of not just cohesion, but proximity. And that any sort of economic structures that disrupt proximity also disrupt the ability of families to live and thrive, right? So there's a lot in that report that we can sort of think about. That the real issue with the Moynihan report, it's not that it lays out the issues wrong. It actually has a fairly decent accounting of structures. It's that it concludes the way to address the problem is to sort of reinscribe a patriarchy, right? And that what Black folks need is patriarchy. And it also calls things a failure that are actually, in many cases, a success, right? So the real issue is not why were Black folks doing so bad in 1965, but rather, given all of the structural things that the report lays out, how weren't they doing so much worse? Mm-hmm. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe that's what we call a mic drop. Yeah. Thank you, Brittany. So, Philip, can you talk about how, the report focuses on Black families as the problem? Good. Yeah, get your mic ready. Can you kind of talk about the legacy that framing had, specifically in terms of the creations of policies we've seen since then?
Yes, a little bit. Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm enjoying this conversation a lot, and trying to sort of adjust my thoughts about what I might say, given who's in the room, because some of what I was going to say, I think I would like to skip over. So let me. So in terms of a policy, if you try to go from Moynihan forward to a policy implication, besides what we were talking about before about marriage policy, family benefits, and all that has been in welfare policy, but it's been welfare policy and having to do with marriage promotion, and so that's sort of where I get on the train is in '96 with welfare reform and the goal of using welfare reform to promote marriage. So I'm not going to say a lot about is how much of a failure that was in terms of policy, both in terms of the punitive aspects of taking away welfare from people who refuse to get married, but also on the other side of actually affirmatively spending money to promote marriage, which is up over $1 billion and not a marriage to show for it in terms of documented results. But I don't think I need to sell that argument very much in this crowd. But I thought maybe one thing I could say that might be helpful is in thinking about sort of the research about this, and there's sort of there's a nice, I'm going to teach, there's a nice research methods thing to think about when you're trying to have this argument, which is if we think about marriage as somewhat of a privileged status, both in terms of the veneration that married people get and the status that's given to them, but also in terms of the selection into marriage. That although there are a lot of people who choose not to be married, on average, the people who are married are people who have more going for them in the first place. And so that's a very strong pattern that we have. People who are married are better off already before they get married. Or are on their way toward that already, and so that's kind of it's hard for me to say that without sounding like I'm saying something bad about the people who are choosing not to be married, but that's not what I mean. But just when you look at the numbers, that's what it is. And so a very tricky thing happens there, and all the research that goes into this kind of policy about marriage promotion is all about how much better people who are married are doing. And there's a recognition that there's some selection into this, and so people, some of them economists, try to study these and figure out selection into marriage, and then still find out sort of the benefits of marriage. But even if you can somehow fix the selection issue, and you're really interested in, well, isn't marriage actually helping people? Marriage is doing good, so therefore we should have more marriage. As a policy response, there's still a problem with that, which is if marriage is a privileged status, then the marriages that we have already, if you sort of imagine a line of people, from most to least privileged, and or in terms of marriages that are from most to least desirable, including partly because of who people have to marry, and then you work your way down that line until you stop having marriages, and so you have all those privileged people who are married and all those less privileged people who are not married, or all those people who didn't have the right opportunity to get married or the right person to marry. You're imagining in this policy world of promoting marriage, you're imagining that the marriage you promote, the marriage you can convince somebody or arrange to have happen, is going to be as beneficial as all those marriages that already are in place. And so that goes beyond the selection problem to the benefits of marriage are. The next marriage you arrange, if that marriage was going to be so useful and have such great benefits to people, they might have already done it, right? So it's sort of like Stephanie was talking about the abusive relationships and all that we've been able to actually get out of by having marriage become voluntary and divorce become possible. You're looking at that pool of people and saying, okay, if you get married, you're going to be like, somebody else, right? Okay. But it's really hard to convince people of this because they can do it study after study after study of showing how married people are better off, and even how marriage makes people better off because the people who get into those kind of marriages get benefits from those marriages. So you can do longitudinal studies that account for selection that still shows that marriage is beneficial for those people, and you're still not accounting. It still doesn't mean that a policy that created another marriage would produce any of that benefit. Right. So it's a hard argument to have. I try to have it all the time, and so I thought I might try to help with that. Okay, point number two, and they're getting shorter. Point number two, there's a very strong sort of cognitive bias that goes along with the cultural dominance, which is the people who are working on policy and making the policy see the benefits of marriage in their own lives, in their family, in the lives of their families, and it's like the the person, 15 people in a lifeboat, 14 die. And the one who survived says, boy, the best thing that ever happened to me was that lifeboat experience. It really made me who I am. And then everybody else says, boy, lifeboats are great, right? Well, it's sort of like this, it's very hard to get yourself out of that kind of thinking, where the experience that you had, people who are happily married and successful and rich and everything else, they see that marriage as a key part of their success. And they want their children to do what they've done. And so there's a very strong sort of cultural impetus to push this message, and they're doing it in their own lives and their own families. And it's not all about antipathy and racism and hostility. It's also really just sort of a more benign cognitive bias. And I say benign, very in that limited way. So it's just hard to get people out of that thinking. And Arlene Geronimous does a great job talking about this when she talks about the norms around waiting to have children. Why it's such a strong frame to say delay childbearing because that's the most beneficial. When there are real downsides to that, especially for black women, when you just look at the health and age patterns, and I won't get into that more. But finally, the failed marriage policy, still it's successful. It fails in terms of promoting marriage, but it is successful in terms of promoting shame and stigma about not being married. So we shouldn't look at that policy and say, this policy is such an extreme failure, why don't you get rid of it? Because policy is not always just about the outcome it says it's about. And that's not to make a conspiracy theory, that's just sort of the reinforcing, the things that are reinforcing about the policy sometimes are that everybody in the room looks around at each other and says, boy, this policy is really important. And it's sort of that kind of what they call virtue signaling now, where it's sort of, I support the policy, you support the policy, we support this policy is very important. And the more you see that people who aren't married are not are having whatever problems it is that you're concerned about, health and education or income and all that, the more it reinforces kind of the need to do this policy and do it better. And the final downside to that is when it doesn't work, and you hear this from the people who are, like I'm thinking of Brad Wilcox and the American Enterprise Institute, and the people who don't like federal intervention and programs in general, they're going to say, well, we tried this policy, but of course, you know how it is with federal programs, and we don't really expect them to. I mean, look at Head Start. Head Start doesn't really work. So even when the marriage promotion policy doesn't work, it ends up reinforcing a larger frame. So last point is the thing about single people, people without families, or people who the thing that. And I guess maybe this is a question, but one of the things that sort of makes me uncomfortable about the family definition and the leave policy, and I'm not familiar with your work at all, but I thought I'm looking at you, but there's no criticism implied at all, is sometimes I want to turn that around and think about it from the point of view of the people who are not, like, we think about the rights of people to take leave to take care of their family members, but I think about the people who don't have anybody to take leave to take care of them. It's sort of the same thing. So you single adults who want to take leave to take care of the people that you love and that are in your families, well, we want someone to be able to take leave to take care of you also, right? So, but it's not. So this family, anyway. So in terms of marriage, what that partly means is instead of trying to get more people into the marriage category, one of the things we really need to try to do is to shrink. I don't want to say I want to hurt married people, but you want to shrink the benefits of marriage, which is to also say to shrink the penalty for not being married, right? It's a little bit like people don't like to talk about it that way, but it's the same with the benefits to education. In a way, I'd like to reduce the benefits to education in terms of the gap between people who have higher education and people who don't, right? Nothing bad about education, but you want to shrink that gap. So in terms of the policy conversation, what I want, and the thing that we really don't get coming out of the Moynihan tradition is instead of moving people into that married category, let's try to figure out ways to make that married category less salient for advantages and privileges of various kinds.
Great, thank you. So Brandy, can you talk about how the kind of legacy of the report shows up in media narratives about Black families, and what you're finding is effective to undo some of the harm of that narrative, or push back against the narrative itself?
Sure. I don't know, did folks do introductions around the room? Okay, so apologies, I'm late. I work for a rapid response organization, and unfortunately this morning was a bit unignorable for us. But my name is Brandy Collins, and I work at Color of Change. It's the largest online racial justice organization in the country. We have about 1.3 million members across the country. And we started in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Our co-founders, like many of us, saw this kind of environmental disaster that had been exacerbated by poor decision making, and saw an absence, or I should say alternatively, a need to hold both government and media accountable to some of these sort of harmful narratives that were being perpetuated around particularly Black and low-income communities. So you would see photos of kind of white people at different places picking up food during Hurricane Katrina, and it was like they're finding food to sustain their family. And then you would see Black folks, and the caption would be they're looting. And that kind of like media imagery we identified as being really harmful. And we live at this kind of intersection of research, action, and media and narrative. And so I think part of what I think about is that we know that policies are super important, and oftentimes part of what my work is premised on is this idea that this sort of Gramscian ideology that cultural change precedes political change, and that oftentimes what happens from a policy standpoint is sort of a codification or the sort of end result of a lot of work around doing cultural change. And I think we can point to examples like the sort of marriage equality fight and others as examples where things became normalized in our media, and then the government reacted, like 10 years later or something like that. And so I say all of that to say that I think, a lot of what we see driving, I wish more of our policy was driven by research, and what often I think tends to happen is that research is cherry-picked in order to support something that is already believed. And I think that is really obvious with the Moynihan report, where here's a report that was like sort of written by this like, liberal person in some ways, talking about different interventions, and has since been co-opted as a means to sort of undo some of the work behind the New Deal, undo some like policy works, and put in place like really harmful criminal justice policies and otherwise that are premised on this idea of this like broken family. And so to go to your like kind of question around this like media piece, we think at Color of Change, or in general media, we look at media in two different ways. So one, there's like Hollywood, and then one, there's like news and local accountability. And so there's a lot of kind of tropes, if I may, that show up in the Moynihan report that you see reflected in both Hollywood and the news. And I want to name kind of a few of them that we see, and maybe one that we interestingly don't see as much. And so one, this kind of emasculization of Black men by Black women. And this is something that you see consistently used as a source of like jokes in TV shows. I think some of the recent attacks, frankly, on Congresswoman Waters have been premised on this idea of this like erratic, crazy, wild Black woman that emasculates this like people. But this general idea of this like justification for all of these articles that people like to put out every now and again around why Black women are still single, because we're like too successful in emasculating Black men, fine. And so you see that trope turn up again and again, and then you see it also in news, when you're talking about families, and interestingly, things that are upheld. Like I can't remember the tie, I think it was around Ferguson, there was like a news report that there was like this viral story about this Black woman that like spanked her son, and everybody was like, oh, that's good parenting, she's really great, and like all of this these kind of things. So it's like conveniently used in one way when it perpetuates a narrative and then used in harmful ways in others. The other thing that's kind of like less talked about that I find interesting around the Moynihan Report, particularly when I'm talking to some of my friends that are organizing in Asian American spaces, is this kind of model minority mythology that gets lifted up in there and the harm that it can actually do to organizing and ignoring some of the issues that are occurring in different immigrant communities, and particularly Asian Indian immigrant communities. And so that's another trope that we see that's kind of introduced in some ways in this report that you see coming up again and again, both in Hollywood and in news. Also, this idea of this sort of radicalization of the Black community as a potential danger that we have to fight back against, that's another thing that comes up in the report. It's interesting because it's released in '65, and I guess around this time was maybe the time of the softening of the image of Martin Luther King Jr., but for a long time he was considered an enemy of the state. But now he's kind of held up as this beacon of, if Martin Luther King was alive today, like he would never support Black Lives Matter, or all of these kind of things. But what you see in the report is this like this sort of light discussion around how like communism, how like communist propaganda, it talks about behavior towards Black people as a means to like bring in more communists, or this like danger of the Black Muslims in this country, or this like movement towards radicalization that we have to fight back against, which is another thing that we see as a trope coming up in Hollywood and media. And then one that I think is kind of interesting that doesn't, that I think we've talked a little bit about here, is this kind of piece around the encouragement of Black men to join the military, which I think is fascinating. The data shows now that Black men are more likely to have been in jail or in the military than to have a college education. And what I find fascinating about this is when we see a lot of stories around the military, often absent from those like narratives of why we have to support our veterans is the fact that like people of color are significantly overrepresented in the military. And so while Congress is sort of stripping a lot of veterans of benefits, but giving them a free beer or like celebrating them in commercials, often those stories that we see in Hollywood are of like white military men. They don't talk about like Native Americans, Black folks, Latino folks dramatically overrepresented in the military. So those are some of the tropes, and I know you want to talk about interventions. And so for us, like some of the interventions that we think about, we think about I'll start with Hollywood and then move to our news. So in Hollywood, one of the things that we see is like the true importance of challenging and converting stories from the inside. And so we have a deep analysis, one, around crime procedurals and how they've like transitioned over time into like sort of depicting cops in these kind of like humanizing ways. Even when they do horrific things, it's for like a good reason. The prosecutor that always makes the right choice, the kind of sneaky defense attorney. And then like plopped in the middle of that, the like problematic family in one way or another, or the Black mother that maybe is trying to do the best she can, but she's overstretched. Or some of the things that we associate with like bad parenting, or one of the conundrums of what it means to be part of the working poor, or like a parent that is working a third shift and maybe isn't able to go to their like 1 o'clock thing at their kid's school, as was referenced earlier. And so we do a lot of work working with writers in newsrooms. Working with writers in Hollywood and bringing them together for dinners and starting to talk to them about the importance of their media and why we need to sort of challenge things a little more differently. And so like one example I want to give of that is when we first did our first writing room a couple of years ago, one of the first people to attend it was actually Kenya Burris, who's producer, writer of Blackish. When he first came into that space, he was actually very resistant. He wanted to kind of create this like Cosby-esque show that in some ways really shied away from talking about things like police brutality and some of these other systemic inequities, and continue to have this like more personal accountability bootstrap work. We kind of did a lot of work with him and through a series of dinners, eventually encouraged or helped him get to this place where he created an episode, a series of episodes really, that talk about Black Lives Matters, that talk about police brutality, one that talks about Trump. I think that was a place that we might not have gotten to with that show were it not for some of those type of interventions. So that's one thing that we do, as well as talking to folks behind the scenes of some of these crime procedurals. Then our other work, and I'll leave it there because I know I'm going long on time, is around news accountability. And so local news still very highly watched. And it's still, unlike Fox or NBC or CNN, where people accept a certain amount of bias around them, is still perceived as being unbiased. We've done a lot of research that shows, and we started in New York, that in local news in New York, for example, Black crime is overreported by up to 77%. And white crime is dramatically underreported. So what it creates is this dynamic where people feel like they're not safe from Black people, which we say creates an environment that is not safe for Black people. And so one of the things that we started doing was talking to folks in the newsroom, sharing with them statistics, using a lot of the research from folks like Charlotte Ryan, who has like a great body of research around framing a narrative, to try to move people towards like asking different questions and presenting different things. Like, do we always need to show a mugshot? What does that do? How are families being introduced or talked about in the local news in different instances? That's some of the work we do. And also looking at the surrogates on like the news circuit for the 24-hour news stations and trying to like get them off the air. So your folks like David Clark or Tommy Loren, or oftentimes these kind of what we call, it's not always Black faces in high places, but oftentimes they do kind of like put up these Black spokespeople that perpetuate these harmful tropes and narratives, and Black on Black crime and all of these things have been debunked and are kind of insulated from critique because of their Blackness. And so we try to do a lot of work, and Nicole and me have been really great with supplying us research to help us challenge some of those folks on the inside. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Hey, Mia, can I mention one quick thing about the research we're doing
Sure.
on this?
Yes, please.
It is not done yet, but and I'm happy to share it with everybody in the room. It is, but Family Story is actually partnered right now with a bunch of the Color Chain folks to do a bunch of research on sort of examining the systemic distortions and inaccuracies in news and opinion media and how they cover Black families. And we've already, we have some preliminary findings, and it's a lot of the things that you mentioned and expect are actually appear to be really true when you do a good content analysis. The news and opinion media is almost 3 times more likely to describe Black family poverty as being the result of laziness or internal deficiencies than to describe white family poverty as attributed to that. They're 4 times more likely to attribute poor educational outcomes for Black children to Black family dysfunction rather than any kind of white family dysfunction for the same thing. To obviously, we all know the trope about depicting Black fathers as absentee and uninvolved, despite the fact that when they live in the same living situations, they're actually as involved, if not more, than fathers of other races. And generally, to describe Black families as a source of societal instability in general, in a way that white families are never described. So I just want to sort of plug some of the work we're doing that's actually proving that.
That's really helpful. So in terms of what I want to ask you all. So Brandy talked about the importance of narrative as laying the groundwork for policy. And Nicole earlier asked about, like, where do we find the vision that we have for what families are? And Brittany answered that question by saying, well, Black people for hundreds of years have been doing family the way that more and more other folks in this country are doing family. So I want to ask you, and I really want to hear from folks in the room who have not spoken. I want to ask you all, what are the stories we need to be telling about Black families, and who is telling those stories? Don't be shy, y'all. or like, what kinds of stories are you interested in hearing more about, even if no one's telling them? Go ahead.
So I know I've spoken, but I think one of the things to think about is how we can expand narratives. I think we spend a lot of time fighting and pushing back and trying to shift narratives. It's really hard to do. But we can also flood the field with different kinds of narratives. And so, shameless plug, my own research.
Yes, please do.
Right? Looks at Black couples, not necessarily married, but couples, hetero couples, because I needed one dissertation, who have been together between 10 and 40 years. Right? And so what it means to have enduring relationships that exist, that have always existed, but don't actually get any airplay and airtime. And so sometimes it's not necessarily creating new stories, it's just lifting up the stories that already exist.
Yes. And I think that's the point too, is that these stories actually do exist. We don't have to invent something. They exist in Black communities, they exist in queer communities, they exist in immigrant communities. But what are those stories that we need to be telling? Fran, go ahead. Get you a mic or yell. Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that this idea, which is completely true in my own personal experiences, of the incredible power of certainly single-parent Black women and their families, and the extended nature of those families, as you described to Brittany, that's something I personally have experienced and I'm aware of. But it seems like in the narrative, public narrative, you see a lot of, for example, sports figures, Black sports figures who attribute all their success to their moms and how strong their moms were. I mean, that I've seen a lot. But I think I think that's good, and I think when we think about cultural change, I guess my question is, does that reinforce the idea that it's exceptional when it's celebrities who talk about the strength of their Black mothers? And is there a way of, how do you translate that, which is certainly important and attracts attention? How do you go from there to the understanding that this is not the exception, this is the norm? So is it almost worse to have it be these celebrities in that understanding?
Tara, go ahead. Can you grab, hand a mic.
I'm a historic low talker. I should use a mic. And I think what like Brittany was raising earlier, and a lesson from the STEM, the kind of world of other people trying to change stereotypes, science space. I think there's a lot more to do on elevating the thing that has been our America. Old stories. This computer that you thought was invented by that guy came from this lady, like in movies, in film. And I think, I don't want to be like too throwback about it, but I think at this particular moment in history, we benefit not from saying, this is our new story, but a little bit of like, this is how resilient we've been for a really long time, and these tools might be used by other people. So I think this goes a bit to like a history lesson that was invisible for a long time.
And I think this is part of what Nicole Mason was saying before, is that when we talk about the history of families, that they're, in addition to Black people being left out, but queer folks are left out. And like, we didn't recently become gay. Like, that's existed for a long time, and people created families, in circumstances where it was way less acceptable to be out. What are other families and stories you all are excited about? Go ahead, who's down there?
But one of the things that I'm wondering about is there a way for us to do this without like romanticizing sort of resilience? So a lot of times when I, tell my story, I'm just like, look, I'm an affirmative action baby. Here are the government programs that helped my single mama to raise me. I went to Upward Bound. The little extra money that we got from that was useful, because there's a sort of thing that happens too where you're asked when you're an exceptional Black person to perform being exceptional and to make it seem like all you did was work hard. One of the stories that I like to tell about my mom, I just finished a new book that'll be out next year, and I tell this story in the book. When I was 7, my mom said to me, we're riding along one day, she says, so how do you feel about coming home after school every day and staying by yourself for 2 hours until I get off from work? I was 7. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. I want to keep going to daycare. But I realized, looking at my mom's face, that it wasn't really a question. It was a like, I'm gonna need you to go home and do these things. And so I stayed home by myself every day after school from age 7 until I went to college. And today my mom would be under the jail. But here is economically what it meant. She asked me to do that at the beginning of at the beginning of 3rd grade. At the beginning of 4th grade, my mother was able to put down a modest down payment on a new house. Literally that choice. And so I write about in the book what it means that a 7-year-old girl has to figure out how to feel safe for 2 hours. And if I couldn't have made the choice, my mom wouldn't have terrorized me. She would have kept paying. But that literally was the difference between our ability to become a solidly middle-class family in rural Louisiana where I grew up versus becoming, continuing to sort of live hand to mouth and pay rent and have, a certain level of housing insecurity. So those are the kinds of stories too that we have to tell when we say, well, what is it? So if we're going to tell stories about children, well, what does it look like for little Black girls to be safe? And how could I tell that story without criminalizing my mother? Because she was an excellent mother, right? So those are the kinds of family negotiations that people are making so that they can sort of make it into the American dream. And what becomes interesting is the level of sacrifice that has to happen at every level. But it also means that the thing that I learned when I looked back over my story is that Black girls learn from that young age that our safety and security often has to be sacrificed in service of the family.
Yep.
Right?
I have the same story, except I was 8.
Yep.
But same thing. Right here, and then Prudence, and then Philip.
Hi, is this on?
It will come on when you keep talking.
I'm Daya Bilal Threets. I'm here representing the National Education Association. We represent educators, a predominantly female profession, so there's lots of intersections. I kind of got invited to this at the last minute and wasn't sure what to expect, but I'm so thrilled by what I'm hearing on so many levels. I also sit here as an African American Muslim woman, and the intersections there just have my mind on a swivel as well. To the question about stories that need to be told, could be told better, in particular around education, educational outcomes, the stories that we tell and hear about public education, how it's the punchline of so many jokes. How it continues to be denigrated in media and in very strategic ways by some very sophisticated messengers. I think a lot more stories could be told and should be told around that, and there's a balance that needs to be considered. I sit on a group that's now thinking about how you share stories about public education, how you share stories about education justice. And while it feels really good and right to be doing that work, there's also a point at which you have to consider, if you tell too many of those stories, are you contributing to the narrative that, well, see, public schools, that's where they send the Black and brown kids to get over-tested. Right, or it's always a story when it's a person of color. It's an against all odds story, right? It's against all odds. Johnny got out of that school and it was broken, the broken glass, in the bars. So that's a lot of the narrative that gets told about public schools writ large, which 90% of people actually send their kids to public schools, but that's not ever talked about, right? And most people want a good neighborhood school. They don't want to mortgage their house to send their kids to a private school. They want a good school right down the street. So I think a lot more could be done in that vein. And then I guess I do have a broader question about some of the narrative work that is being done, and that is kind of what are the strategies, particularly when I'm listening to the conversations about family and the different the different ways families are constructed and perceived. What are the conversations we're having with churches, mosques, and those institutions that also culturally, I think Phil made this point, really do define family in a very specific way, not necessarily the nuclear way, and they certainly don't determine that policy should be in any part of the picture, but the conversations with them, conversations with the genealogy industry that is now unearthing so much about what families actually looked like for centuries, and what some of the thinking is around how these stories get told, who they get told to, and who's part of that storytelling.
Thank you. I'm
think I can be heard. So I wanted to take it back to that question of kind of telling stories, and I think Cecilia Munoz referenced this, and Brittany, I really appreciated your response. I work at the American Bar Association primarily on legal issues affecting families who are involved in the child welfare system. And so there are a lot of these sort of narratives of how we talk about policy and state intervention with families that has some really scary history and certainly scary present involvement as well. But I wanted to answer sort of Mia's question. I did want to go back to that question of what stories do we tell? And one of the things that concerned me is this idea that you do get, and we have found this too, you do get a lot of traction when you tell stories about a child. And I think that what upsets me so much about that is that to me a child, and I have 3 of them myself, but a child is a part of a family, right? And when you isolate out that child's story as though it is a child's story and as though you are only talking about a child, and you're not talking about the child within the fabric of the family, and the family meaning not just who the father is, who the mother is, which is in many circumstances irrelevant, but talking about who are the people who are raising and contributing to that child's life. And I think that that's something that when we talk about sort of what are the powerful and important stories to raise up, to me that's a really key theme to keep in mind of sort of when you're ever talking about a child and sort of getting attention because you're telling a story about a child, never separate that from who has shaped that child and sort of recognize that policymakers, I think, often find it easy to make policy to help children and in the child welfare system more than ever, but they're not thinking about sort of that larger fabric of you know, that child is not in isolation. The other thing I wanted to raise on the stories piece, which I think resonates a little bit with some of the messages that have just come out, is I actually just 2 days ago was having lunch with a young woman who had gone through foster care and has been really adamant about going into this work as she does work on a policy side to try and reform the system, but she's very adamant about not telling her personal story too much because she feels like it is taken advantage of, and she feels like she actually loses agency, especially when she's asked to do things like present her story to policymakers without there being any next step, that it's just for the sake of telling a story because everyone likes a good story. And so I think that that's the other challenge to me as we talk about what are the important stories to raise up. It's kind of like, well, what's the point, right? Like, what's the strategy? And I think your point on that of, you know, if the message that is received by the audience is, well, look at that amazing individual who fought all odds and succeeded, I think that the message and the sort of takeaway ends up being really warped and not helpful. So really thinking strategically about using stories in a way that keeps agency where agency needs to be moving forward. Exactly, and anticipating audience and making sure that you're sort of hesitant about some of the audience reaction.
On the question of the against all odds and the people who are heroic and the resilience, we need, in terms of policy, we need to think about, and you know, I'm sure a lot of you know this. I feel like we need to make the argument that we need to make policy for people who are not excellent and people who don't, like, we can't, like, we can be inspired by stories of resilience and grit and people who succeed against all odds, but that's not who the policy is really for. We have to have policy for people whose parents are, you know, a little bit irresponsible. We need to have policy for people whose parents try but really can't get it together. We need to have policy for you know, a lot of people who are not, we just can't, you know, we can't make policy for lottery winners. That's just not the way it's going to work. And so, and they're children, right? So in terms of the vision, you know, what's our vision? I hate to be, I'm always like when you really press me is when I really come out like on negative stuff about families. You know, but it's not. I don't think it really has to be that way. Vision-wise, I think I'd like to have policies and a society where people don't really need their families, and then we can still have families. But if you really, really need it, it's that's a warrant. You know, that's a potential trouble, because then if you don't have it, you're in big trouble. So it's a little bit like you don't want to create a society of people who can't take care of themselves and their loved ones, and you don't want to have that be a goal. But you want to have the less we need our families, the more our families are voluntary and the things that we really like. And they can still provide all kinds of great things, benefits, and so on. But it's if you don't have this, you're dead, or if you don't have this, you're in deep, deep trouble. That's what that's where I think it's a problem. And it's I make the distinction between, when I teach, I try to make the distinction between the advice you give your friends or loved ones versus policy. So you want your the advice is, you know, I am thinking of Bridget Schulte's great stuff about grit in the book, blanking on the name of your book. It was great. Overwhelmed, thank you. Right, and so it's all that, you know, that stuff about raising children and teaching to learn from failure and all that stuff is you want to encourage that and do that, but if you count on it in terms of policy, then the people who can't do it or don't do it are going to be in trouble. So it's sort of that balance anyway. So.
Claire, and then Julie, and then both you briefly, and then lunch. So
yeah, I'll be very quick. Good. Yeah, I'll be quick. So here's a story that is statistically true, but certainly is not told in the popular media, and even I think among policy circles is not always as well known, which is that Black fathers who are not married to the mothers of their children and do not live with their children are much more involved with their children and have better relationships with the mothers of their children than white fathers who are not married and don't live with their kids. So there's a lot to learn from that. Yeah.
It's actually the perfect segue, because that was around my point, and it kind of builds on Prudence's point about contextualizing the stories that we tell. Because while I love the work that you all are doing about kind of making invisible Black fathers visible, I also worry about the point that Brittany raised earlier about this, you know, kind of that fueling then the trope that boys in particular need fathers, and that, again, those families that don't have fathers are further disadvantaged, and especially boys. And so I think if we can be raising the invisibility, not just of Black fathers, which we need to do, but also of kind of all the family members that are invisible and in playing important roles in children, I think that's kind of what's incumbent upon us, is that we can't just, you know, kind of make one piece or one slice of families visible. Yeah. We have to really be doing it in the most holistic way.
So I think it's Black dads are they're not absent, and they're also not necessary.
Yes.
Right? Like,
right. Yes.
So it is time for lunch. Lunch is out here in the hall before you get up. We are going to take some of the themes that we've heard and write them on some big paper and put them on the wall. I also want you to be thinking about some of the themes you've heard. Go back to the first session and the second session and then the one we just had, as a jumping off point for us kind of doing some individual, small group, and big group thinking and workshopping around like how these things actually apply to our work and lives. All right, go eat. You have half an hour.